must be the most marvelous supper. We may not eat it, but it must be marvelous.
Welcome to Season 5 of How Would Lubitsch Do It, a podcast in which we discuss the works of director Ernst Lubitsch, one film at a time. We're back for the last hurrah of the podcast. We begin our final stretch on a discussion with William Paul, author of the critical study, Ernst Lubitsch's American Comedy. Come visit ernstcast.com if you'd like show notes, resources as to where you might find the films we'll be discussing, a link to our Discord, or just to say hi. A very light word of caution as we begin this 3-hour episode, culled from over 5 hours of recordings based on 2 interviews with Bill. One a little earlier in the month, and the other one a little later in the months. This is the rare episode in which I've made no attempt to make this legible to someone listening to this podcast for the first time or with little familiarity with Ernst Lubitsch. However, if you're interested in the most in-the-weeds of discussions about Ernst Lubitsch's working methodology, comedic theory, and for some genuinely new insights and revisions of previously held notions about the man, this might be the episode for you. I'm tremendously excited to present it. Enjoy. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We're here with William Paul. William Paul is, among many other things, the author of one of the key texts of this podcast. It is a book called Ernst Lubitsch's American Comedy. If you haven't read it, if you're not familiar with it, I urge you to look up your local library, go to eBay, find somewhere where you can access this book, buy a used copy. It's one of the best books I've read on Lubitsch, and it's genuinely an incredible piece of analysis of Lubitsch, and I'm so excited to have you on here, Bill. Thank you so much for making the time. It's an honestly tremendous honor.
Oh, thank you for your comments.
Well, thank you for being here. I'd love to start by talking about your friendship with Samson Raphaelson. The listeners in the show by this point are probably well aware. Sam was the screenwriter on 9 of Lubitsch's films and a longtime collaborator, friend of Lubitsch. He wrote a work that I've probably referenced a few times at this point, which is Freundschaft, published in the New Yorker years after Lubitsch's death. It's maybe my favorite thing ever written by any of Lubitsch's collaborators about their collaboration with Lubitsch. You knew Samson in the last decade or so of his life. I'd love to hear about that.
I met him when a group of students at Columbia University had put together an evening, discovering that he lived in New York, and put together an evening inviting him to come up to campus and have a screening of Trouble in Paradise. I probably had an influence on the choice of film, and then have him just comment on it and see how things went. And so he came with his wife, Dorshka, who I would become good friends with as well. And he had not seen the film in 50 years. So right after the screening, his immediate reaction was that 2 grown men could make a film like that in the depths of the Depression is just beyond belief. So afterwards, I went up and introduced myself with a kind of, I guess, youthful enthusiasm, feeling it was okay to instruct him that actually, from my point of view, the movie is centrally concerned with the Depression, and I'd like to have a chance to prove it to him. And so he invited me down to his house in the West 60s, half a block away from Central Park, where, according to Dorshka, his ashes are now buried. And it was really at the beginning of an unlikely friendship. I said unlikely because he was 50 years older than I was at the time. I realize now that I'm actually the age he was when he first met me. And I almost feel closer to him being at this age. I can't recreate what happened in that conversation, but I know it began during daylight. And when I left, it was dead dark outside. Over the next 10 years, I just had frequent conversations with him. I was doing a lot of research for the book at the Performing Arts Library, which was around the corner from his apartment. And so I would occasionally just stop by afterwards for a chat. They were far-ranging. A lot of it was about Lubitsch, initially mostly about Lubitsch, but they went off in other directions. But another time, we did talk about his work for Hitchcock, too. It was a great experience, and it did have a real impact on my writing in the book, just his insights that he offered about Lubitsch.
Is there any conversations you had in particular that sticks out that informed your writing, especially Ernst Lubitsch's American Comedy?
I can give you one thing that was important to me in terms of what I thought. But a lot of it was, just listening to the way that he talked about Lubitsch Rafe would often say it, and I think he says in Freundschaft as well, is by the later part of the collaboration, Lubitsch had really changed to the extent that when he was working for Lubitsch, it was more like writing a play for him. It was like the work that he did as a playwright, whereas the earlier films were not like that at all. In the very early films, working with Lubitsch, which would be Smiling Lieutenant and Trouble in Paradise, they would be working out the dialogue and working out the plot. One thing that he has said in other interviews, and I think in Freundschaft as well, is that, Lubitsch based a lot of his films on these obscure Hungarian plays, and that he would never let Rafe read them. And he said the reason was it would make it difficult for him to come up with solutions that were different from the plays. And that's what he wanted. He didn't want to go in the direction of the plays. He'd borrow sort of a basic plot outline from the play, but wanted to come up with his own solutions for how that plot would work. He would just tell Rafe, here's what the story is and what we're going to have to do. In the early work, when he was just beginning his collaboration with Lubitsch, he would say things that he thought were kind of off the wall. I don't think that was Rafe's expression, but it was something like that. That's things where there's sort of an outrageous suggestion or kind of ridiculous kind of comedy. And Lubitsch would say, great, that's just what I was looking for.
One example Raphaelson mentions in Freundschaft is the scene where Lily regulates Gaston's watch.
Oh, right.
It was 5 minutes slow, but I regulated it for you.
At the beginning, and that was one where he said he was just blue sky thinking, just throwing it out there, and Lubitsch went, no, we're going to use that.
Yeah, that would happen a lot. The other thing I'll say in terms of what he contributed, anything that has something to do with advertising, I will say the song that transitions to the main narrative in Trouble in Paradise is pure Raphaelson, because he worked in advertising. He was writing short stories along the time that he was working in advertising. And one of his plays, Skylark, male lead is an advertising executive. So anything that's about advertising in the films he did with Lubitsch is from Rafe. I think this is an odd point of connection between the two that Rafe didn't quite see, is that Lubitsch loved the story of The Princess and the Pea. And the reason was it asked the important question of, how does a princess sleep? All those mattresses that she has to sleep with. He said it was something he would always come back to in trying to work out a character. Come back to the thing about how does a princess sleep? Well, how would this character do something that's in line with the character? And a lot of Raphaelson's plays are based on, I think, a kind of similar thinking. 4 of the 9 plays that got produced on Broadway are actually named after the central character. It's really character that does drive a lot of Rafe's thinking, and I think is an important contribution to Lubitsch because it's what Lubitsch really wanted as well. I think there's occasionally differences. If you look at I should bring up now that I had Xeroxes of all Rafe's copies of his screenplays, and he wrote comments on them. And a lot of them are about things that he complains about what the characters say or things that would be unlikely for the character to say. So I'll give you an example. In Merry Widow, on the first meeting between Danilo and Sonia, between Chevalier and Jeanette MacDonald, he's intrigued because he can't see her face.
Mm-hmm.
He says, are you beautiful or gorgeous? Something like that. And he writes in the comments, this is the richest woman in Marshova. She owns 52% of the country. How can he possibly not know what her face looks like? There are many comments like that in the screenplay where he's really questioning, how did we get away with something so stupid in doing this?
It's an interesting comment in a film where someone at some point tries to make change for an egg. Right.
That's actually one comment I like. He said basically that they missed a kind of comic point there because it's where he's selling the newspaper about Danilo's imprisonment. And the newspaper was originally, I couldn't read this, he sketched it out, but in the script it was called the Daily Herald or something like that. And Rafe wrote in the comments accurately that they changed it to the Daily Move. For the company. But then he added a thing. It actually is a better joke. He adds, we should have called it the Daily Moose, which of course invokes actually one of the last standing tabloids in New York, the Daily News.
Mm-hmm.
So funny kind of comments like that. But a lot of these, as I said, it's really just very focused on character. Does this make sense for this character to do this? He questions some of the early scripts. Oddly enough, Shop Around the Corner has no comments for him. I'm sure that he showed it and taught it in the classes that he was teaching at Columbia. He taught classes at Columbia in that period. After that first meeting, people were so delighted with his presence that they thought it would be great to have him teach a class in screenplay. I think that's where the commentary on the screenplays come from, because he showed, a number of the Lubitsch films. And looking at them again, he went through the scripts again and wrote the comments, because the comments are dated 1976. And it would make sense that they were written in response to what was going on in the class. He also loved to tear apart L'Avventura, which was very big in certain intellectual circles in that period. And he did it a lot in terms of character. Again, it's the ways in which he felt the characters were incoherent from his sense. That's the way he would criticize the film. But he loved doing it. I think he did it in every class he taught, in part because it was such a highly regarded film in the period.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, this makes sense given his, for example, Trouble in Paradise. He's expressed that amazement that is one of the films that kind of has lasted in the historical memory, given that he thinks of it as a lark compared to the seriousness of something like Shop Around the Corner.
Yeah, as I said, I tried to convince him otherwise. I don't know if that was successful. He did read the book when it was in page proofs. He died before it came out, unfortunately. But he liked it well enough to give me a very nice blurb on the back, and particularly praised the writing. The other thing I know I wanted to bring up, this is the one thing I would have let Ray censor if he objected to it. I saw a kind of linguistic similarity in the dialogue of Lubitsch's silent films that was pretty consistent across films, regardless of who the screenwriter was. I'm pretty sure, this is basically when I just saw a manuscript, but I read this to Rafe, so I would deliberately chose different screenwriters across the 30s to get at this. One of the things I said, and it's because of the dialogue, is, let me just read a little bit of this. An individual actor will leave his distinctive mark on the film naturally, yet a Gary Cooper or James Stewart cast in a Lubitsch film ends up sounding more like other Lubitsch characters than other Cooper or Stewart characters, because there is a verbal consistency in Lubitsch's films, regardless of the screenwriter, that it helps determine how the lines will be read. For example, Lubitsch and his screenwriters create a strong rhythmic effect in the dialogue by repeating verbal or syntactic structures from line to line. And then I said, here are a few examples. In Design for Living, Tom explains his hurt feelings over Gilda's romance with George.
George betrayed me for you. Without wishing to flatter you, I understood that. I can still understand it. But you betrayed me for George. An incredible choice.
In Ninotchka, Leon tries to persuade Ninotchka the universal power of love in the following fashion.
Ninotchka, why do doves bill and coo? Why do snails, the coldest of all creatures, circle interminably around each other? Why do moths fly hundreds of miles to find their mates? Why do flowers slowly open their petals?
To Be or Not to Be, actress Maria Turner explains to the Gestapo, Professor, if you die in the theater, afterwards you get up and take a bow. But if you die in real life, afterwards you're just dead. And then, having to wait, Henry tries to explain the virtues of his new love to his mother.
It's an entirely different kind of music. It's not the hoochie coochie. It's not the can-can. It's like a waltz by Strauss. Like a minuet by Mozart.
And then finally, in Clooney Brown, Adam Belinsky berates stuffy Hillary Ames for not taking a greater interest in Belinsky's problems.
You're the most selfish man I've ever seen. What? You don't even know me, and already you're not interested in me. Why don't you ask me why I want to see Professor Lee? All you're thinking about is the Honorable Betty Cream. Why don't you ask me about my landlady? Is she humane, or does she want the rent? Do you know, or do you care? No.
And I said there's a kind of artificiality of the language here, and this kind of rhythmic play that is consistent. And if he had objected, I would have said, okay, I'll cut it. What he did, and he always did this, he had this gesture of raising his hand with his index finger and slicing it as a kind of point of emphasis. And he just said, that's Lubitsch. By that, what I thought he meant is that when you were writing a film with Lubitsch, you were also writing for Lubitsch. It's at that point, and this is probably in French, I can't remember, but it's the first time I heard it from him. He said in an interview, after that, he said, Lubitsch wrote some of my best lines, and I gave him some of his best touches. And that's the way the collaboration worked. But it was clear that when he was writing for Lubitsch, he was writing for Lubitsch. He had to write in the style of Lubitsch.
Almost all the writers for Lubitsch in the Hollywood era, after Hans left the picture, would have had a preconceived notion of what a Lubitsch film is, especially when you get to the later writers like Wilder and Brackett, where it's almost like how Ernest Lehman described writing North by Northwest for Hitchcock, right? Where it was almost a postmodern exercise in writing a Hitchcock movie, where it feels like Raphaelson and Wilder, Brackett, etc., all the other later writers, it was, okay, we know what field we're playing in, and it's almost basing your writing off of your own preconceived notion of what you should write.
Yeah, they knew what a Lubitsch film was by that point. It's certainly the way he worked with Raphaelson. As I said, Hitchcock was very different in this regard. They were always writing together, which is why he said, and in certain ways, he doesn't know which lines he wrote and which lines Lubitsch wrote.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's probably true with the other writers. And if Lubitsch is contributing to the dialogue, you're going to end up writing in that style.
As far as the actual process goes, and then we can bridge into the Hitchcock anecdote, the way that I've been kind of led to believe that the Lubitsch writing room went, I forget who described it as kibitzing, but this verbal, not quite an argument, but a heated, lively exchange of ideas with a stenographer on hand, and then a later revision of that, maybe with paper involved. Is that an accurate characterization of it?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I'd forgotten about the stenographer was always there, he said. And basically, it was just sort of throwing things against the wall and seeing what sticks.
Mm-hmm.
It's the kind of thing that, again, that goes back to this thing of not wanting him to know the original play, right? Because you would fall into patterns that would have been dictated by the original. It would be very hard to lose your sense of that and go in different directions. Now, why Lubitsch could do that, but not Raphaelson, could be another question. I guess at that point, Lubitsch was so confident about who he was artistically that he felt he could break free, that he could use these things as points of departure.
I almost feel like it's so divergent at certain points. Like The Merry Widow is a good example where it feels like it shares a high concept and some melodies, and that's it.
Yeah.
It's a totally distinct work.
I will tell you, actually, another thing, I did find some of the obscure Hungarian plays, for example. Angel in particular, which is very different. In Angel, the source play is much more of a comedy than the Lubitsch film. But in any case, yeah. With Merry Widow, I did, and I listened to a recording of all the music. And what really intrigued me, well, I think there's two things. I can say that there are songs indicated in the screenplay with lyrics that were dropped from the final version. So he did use some more of the music than there are in the final version of the film. And for all I know, that they even shot them. Well, you'd always pre-record the songs, so they probably did record them too. At some point, they were cut from the film, maybe for length. I'm not sure why. I asked Rafe about this because a lot of the songs that were not used in the film actually are used on the soundtrack as background music a number of times. And I was curious about that. I said, well, who would have determined that we should use this particular moment from the source play as background music for this scene? I wish I could give you something more specific. I was more on top of it at that time. He just said it was Lubitsch. Nobody else would do that. That was Lubitsch. He had complete control over everything that appeared in the film. And I think, there's other evidence for that too, which is Zanuck always gave Lubitsch carte blanche, and even Irving Thalberg, the stories about the difficulties that Norma Shera had with his direction.
Yeah.
That she went to her husband to complain, and he came down to the set and watched a little bit. And he said, I think he should listen to Herr Lubitsch.
That's one of the only times I've ever heard Irving Thalberg express something like that.
Yes, I know. Exactly.
It's so out of character.
And that was to his wife. There was this idea that Lubitsch was always the ultimate arbiter of everything that goes into his films, regardless of who he was working with. One of the other things we might talk about, working with Hitchcock, because Rafe said that Hitchcock's manner of working was radically different from Lubitsch, which is when he became involved in the project, he was presented with a detailed and thorough outline, scene-by-scene breakdown of the action. And that basically he was hired as a dialogue writer. Interestingly enough, because his plays aren't all comedies, but he was known most for his comedies on Broadway. And those, after Jazz Singer, it's a couple of the comedies were his most successful and longest runs. And I think Hitchcock wanted the kind of wit in the repartee of the characters and suspicion that he thought Rafe could bring to it. Curiously, this is a bit like Lubitsch, is that Hitchcock in England, for sure, and a lot of the American career, liked to work with playwrights. That was often his preferred people to work with. And I think it's partly this idea is that he would work out the plot in great detail, and then the playwright would contribute to the dialogue. There's a lot of commentary from actors and actresses who worked with Hitchcock in recent years about the way direction would begin before the production, that he would have a meeting with the actor and talk through the entire plot, trying to give an actor a sense of what their character would be in that plot. And I think there's evidence that this is the way he worked with screenwriters as well. If I can maybe do a little digression on this.
Sure.
At some point, I hope this essay will come out, but I've got what I think is a very good essay, Unfinished on the Wrong Man. And he worked with Maxwell Anderson on that, who was at that period in the 50s, was very well regarded playwright, serious playwright. And the Hitchcock papers, the Academy Library, have extensive correspondence between him and Anderson. And he was mostly pleased with the work that Anderson was doing. Again, the screenplay, the plot of it was pretty fully worked out. But at some point when he was getting the scenes from Anderson, Anderson's version of it begins in the house of the Ballesteros during daytime and the kids are awake and that kind of thing. And Hitchcock said, no, they had to rework this. He really wanted it to begin at the Stork Club and have that somewhat disturbing nighttime scene between Henry Fonda and Vera Miles. So a lot of that material was covered in this daytime scene that began the Maxwell Anderson script. So, he just said, okay, we have to rework this. Threw it back to him. Now work out the dialogue as it should be. So I think a lot of that is the way that he worked with Rafe. Unlike Lubitsch, he did see Hitchcock every day of the writing, but he, I think, had an office at the studio and would work on the dialogue. And then he would go back to Hitchcock's house. I don't know if this is in Fern Shop, it might be. You can tell me. He would go back to Hitchcock's house and walk in. Hitchcock was always, he wanted, whatever the room he went into, he was standing behind a bar with a cocktail shaker, shaking it as Rafe walked in, making orange blossoms, which apparently was his preferred drink. And Rafe would walk up to the bar and Hitchcock said, well, let me see what you did for today. And apparently he was a phenomenal speed reader. So he would just read like this, turning the page over and over again and going through the scene that Rafe wrote for that day and just say, very nice, very good. And that was it. And that's the way it worked. Now, of course, one of the questions I had, because it is always the big question about suspicion, is how the film was actually supposed to end. I thought, okay, Rafe might be able to answer that. Or, for example, he gave me the copy of the screenplay that he had. And I said, great, this is going to be the answer. Well, this turned out to be actually a rather bizarre thing, because in the copy of the screenplay that he had, and I did copy this, and it's the only one of the screenplays that was stolen from my office. But in the screenplay that he had, there was actually a fourth act after the Cary Grant character realizes that Joan Fontaine thinks that he is a murderer and that you're responsible for Nigel Bruce's death and wants to kill her. And the film doesn't end there. There's a fourth act where he walks out on the marriage because he thinks they obviously can't stay together if that's what she thinks of him. And then what happens is World War II begins. And Cary Grant joins the RAF.
Oh my gosh, what a twist.
And in the meantime, Lena, I think the character's name is, Joan Fontaine, becomes a nurse who ministers to soldiers who have been injured in the war. I don't think I have to give you the rest of the plot. You can figure out it becomes the resolution of their marriage. They can meet again on equal footage brought about by World War II.
Wow.
And I had to see Rafe quickly after that. I called up and said I had to come over. And I said, I don't think you've reread this. And did you write this? Because I found it hard to believe that he would have written something like that. And, he looked at it, read it, and said, no, I had nothing to do with that. He said, it's likely it was Joan Harrison, Hitchcock's associate who had become the producer of his television shows, is that she probably had something to do with this. But he said, no, that was not me. On the other hand, whether there's anything different he didn't have a memory of the film beyond that. Whether or not there's anything different in the screenplay from what the current ending of the film is not available. I think the current ending of the film, Hitchcock notwithstanding, his suggestion that Cary Grant, in fact, was a murderer, but he would basically give himself away by sending a letter to the police from his wife that would implicate him in the murder. In any case, I think, for me, the film actually makes perfectly good sense. It's a film about fantasy and the difficulty of people to understand each other. Not unusual in Hitchcock. That was the way he worked with Hitchcock. The other thing he said about Hitchcock that I find interesting is that, and I think he says this in Freundschaft as well, is that he really felt he had a friendship with Hitchcock that was more apparent at the time than his relationship with Lubitsch. He genuinely liked Hitchcock. He liked Alma. He would see them socially. He and Dorschke had a place in rural Pennsylvania they always referred to as the farm, and that he would invite Hitchcock down to the farm when he was in New York, and they would come and visit for a few days and so on. And at one of the times when they were meeting socially, Hitchcock described to him what he thought was an interesting story about a person who works in a church who murders somebody and then goes to confession and confesses to the priest that he's the murderer, but the priest then becomes a suspect in the murder. Raphaelson said, not a very interesting story from my point of view. And he said that, it's obviously I confess is what he was describing, and seeing if Raphaelson might be interested. At least this is the way Rafe saw it after the fact, if he might be interested. And he said, that he thinks because he was so dismissive of a story that obviously meant a great deal to Hitchcock, Hitchcock never asked him to work on anything else after that. And he was surprised because he thought they had a very good working relationship. He liked him as a friend and he enjoyed working with him. So he was very surprised that he didn't ever ask him again. I have tried to look at some of the other screenplays. There's not a lot of them that Raphaelson wrote. And they were important for him in terms of his plays weren't always successful. And in terms of being able to live the life that he did, he would go to Hollywood as a money-making thing. I think the screenplay, it's not a great movie, but I think his most interesting work outside of the Lubitsch films is Green Dolphin Street in 1947. I only recently looked at. I had not seen before. And the thing that intrigued me the most, though, is it was directed by Victor Saville. And I said, wait a second, there's a connection there with Hitchcock. And Saville was British. He was working in Hollywood for that time. He actually returned to England. He began primarily as a producer, then began directing, I think, in the late 30s or 40s. And then in the 50s was still often just doing producing rather than directing. The first two films that Hitchcock worked on in 27, 28, they were directed by Graham Cutts, were both produced by Saville. And Saville was one of his closest friends. So I think, unbeknownst to Raphaelson, that the likeliest reason for his being hired by Saville for the screenplay was that it was Hitchcock's recommendation. And that actually brings me to another point, because I am convinced that Rafe did not know this, is that Lubitsch became very interested in Raphaelson because of The Jazz Singer, and that Warner Brothers bought the rights because Harry, according to the article, Charles Musser, Jack Warner didn't like the play. But Warner Brothers bought the rights because Lubitsch wanted to film it, and that he was involved in some of the early work on the screenplay. And I think one of the reasons that Lubitsch hired him was because of The Jazz Singer. I don't think Rafe ever knew that. I think he would have mentioned it.
Something I at least inferred through all the all the writing, because it makes perfect sense. If the man who wrote the play that, in this case, Lubitsch pushed to bring to Hollywood, you're going to keep that person in mind, probably.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, when he began working with them, I think he saw a kindred spirit, and they just did really like working together. And I think, that's the thing in the Freundschaft article, initially is that for years he thought he had a great working relationship with them, and then realized it was a friendship, but did not at the time.
That's the central melancholy of that article, right? This kind of simultaneous wish on Rafe's side that they could have almost had that conversation where they made their friendship explicit that they never really had in the way that he had almost like fantasized about.
Yeah.
He comes to the conclusion that Lubitsch was not really one to have that conversation in the first place, perhaps. In Freundschaft, there's one incredibly touching passage, right, where Rafe thinks Lubitsch is dying, and this is towards the end of Lubitsch's life. He writes a sort of eulogy for him, and Lubitsch finds out, and they have a conversation where Lubitsch edits it. They do Lubitsch's writing process on, his own obituary, essentially. And at the end, Lubitsch goes, "Now, you know what? The way you had it, just use that," which is probably the closest they ever had to having that conversation, I guess.
Right. And he liked it because of the direct emotion of it, I think. I think I should get into the anecdote of my experience of Freundschaft.
Definitely.
As I had written recently in a little piece that I read at a film studies conference, I am very familiar with that article, but the first time I ever actually read it was this past year, about several months ago when I was working on a new essay about Lubitsch for an anthology that's coming out next year. Here's how I knew it, though. There was one time where Rafe actually called me to come over. It's usually our meetings were initiated by me, but this one time where he called and he said he really wanted me to come by. He had something to do when I got there, and I had no idea beforehand. So when I got there, Dorsta was in the living room, as she often was, but she left, and Rafe took up his position on a couch, motioned for me to sit down on a chair that was placed diagonally towards the couch so I'd be facing him directly. And he took up a sheet of papers. He said, whenever I finish any kind of writing, the first thing I do is read it out loud to Dorsta. And he said, that's whether it's a play, a short story, or an essay. He said, so I wrote this article about Lubitsch, and I've already read to Dorska. And Dorska was usually like the final stage. When he read it to Dorska, if she liked it, he knew he was ready to get it published, get it into production, whatever. And he said, I read this essay to Dorska, and what I would like to do is to read it aloud to you. And he began to do that. And for however long it took to read, I sat there completely rapt. And I like that you brought up the scene, the moment of the writing, working on the eulogy, because that was the moment I have the most vivid memory of from the reading, is as he's reading that, I thought it was both hilarious, to use one of Dorska's words, and she always pronounced it that way, hilarious. It was both incredibly funny. At the same time, it was very moving. So I was basically laughing and crying at the same time at that point. And he finished it, and I was kind of speechless, partly because of him doing something that was very privileged with me, but also by the content of it. As you said, the kind of underlying melancholy of the piece, the recognition of what he had with Lubitsch that he fully didn't recognize at the time. And at the time, I'm not quite sure. I mean, I have a slightly different way of looking at it now than I did then. I wasn't playing the role of Dorska. He wasn't asking for my approval in reading it to me. But what I think now, just looking back on this moment, is that this was actually a way of thanking me for the conversations we had over the previous 6-7 years. At that point, I feel like I'm on the verge of tears now, as I'm very grateful to him for that, for what I think itself was a kind of gift of friendship that I didn't fully recognize at the time. I can tell you, it's for that reason I never read the piece. I couldn't read it because it's his reading to me was what I wanted to remain primary in my experience of that piece. Although it was quite wonderful to read it finally again and to go back to that. It was a great moment.
I can only imagine. I don't have any good follow-up to that because now I moved. Maybe the best way to go forward is for me to clumsily segue into the aforementioned Don Amici story from Heaven Can Wait, how he was cast.
This was Lubitsch's first film for Zanuck, and he ended up completing only 2 of them. He said that he had carte blanche from Zanuck, and most people he worked with in Hollywood were willing to do that for him. He was much admired, even among the moneyed people, although his movies were never that commercially successful, except for a few. And he told Rafe that he could cast anybody he wanted in the films. I'm going to interpolate something here because I think this is an important fact. This is not a reason that Lubitsch presented to Rafe, but it's a reason I suspect was the case, is that the film was obviously going to be very expensive. It was his first film in Technicolor, and ultimately, except for the incomplete final one. And shooting in Technicolor added tremendously to the cost of the film. The second thing was it's kind of a film that goes through periods, which means that it was going to be very expensive on the production side because you had a lot of different costumes from different periods that had to be accurately produced. And then even the settings would keep changing. Although the house is the same, it changes its look throughout the film. Initially it has a slightly Victorian look to it, and then it changes throughout. So in other words, it's going to be one of Lubitsch's most expensive films. And he did say to Ray, now I can cast the film any way I like, but I know that Zanuck would be happy if I looked at his contract players. And I wanted to check on this because if you look at that Fox contract players, they were kind of depleted in some of their stronger male leads like Henry Fonda and Tyrone Pollard. And so, not that I think either one of them would have been right for the part, but they were fairly big stars by this period. They were not available. And so Amici, who was pretty good box office for the studio, was a likely case. And so Lubitsch said, just to please Zanuck, I gave him a screen test that I'd like you to see. And Raphaelson said, okay. So he takes Rafe to see the screen test. And at the end of it, Rafe turns to Lubitsch and said, he's really good in this. And Lubitsch said, yes, isn't it awful? So he felt like he had to use him. By the time of Clooney Brown, though, it's, that neither Boyer or Jennifer Jones, you had to pay extra for because Selznick always extracted. She was under exclusive contract to him, and it says by permission of David or Selznick, which would always be the case when she was in a non-Selznick film. And you had to pay extra for her, too. In that case, he did not go to Fox players, but both Tierney and Amici were. I also want to say one other thing. This is based on a past conversation that you and I had about whether or not Heaven Wait censors a bit of material, but it might be better if it was a little more salacious. I think the casting of Amici actually plays against that. And maybe this is ultimately what Lubitsch did want, is that Amici is very boyish, and he is certainly not as sexual as Tyrone Power would have been in the part.
No.
At all. And I think that's part of it. There's a certain degree in which his reprobate life is somewhat fantasy as well. And I think the casting really does play into that. And for me, it works. Maybe not for you.
It's a film where it was one of the earliest Lubitsch films I saw when I was first starting, and I fully went over my head, I must admit. And actually, it was revisiting it for the show that really moved me to appreciate what it does and the film's meaning to Lubitsch, especially. The great shot where you have the wide frame outside of Don Amici's bedroom door and the Merry Widow's Waltz starts playing as he's dying. Crane dollies backwards and then tilts down to hell.
Right.
That use of the Merry Widow's Waltz, I think I saw that after I had read Ernst Lubitsch's American Comedy, where you explicitly connect that song with death in Lubitsch's cinema. I think that enabled that scene to really hit for me.
Yeah, no, it's powerful. It's also partly because it is preceded by and echoes The Last Dance with Martha.
Mm-hmm.
Which is also to the Merry Widow Waltz. And the camera then cranes up and away from them. Part of the power of the iteration, of the reiteration of it, is that first scene, I think, too.
Mm-hmm. The contrast.
I said for me, it is the Lubitsch film that is most haunted by death, which is strong enough in Merry Widow, too. But it's that thing where you begin to realize, and actually I had not thought about Raphaelson in this too, where you begin to realize that every time you get to a new episode, you jump a time period, somebody's going to disappear from the cast without commentary, and you realize, oh, they died. That scene with Martha and Henry dancing is the only time we're given an advance notice that a character is about to disappear from the narrative. But because it becomes a rhythm of the film, it becomes part of your felt experience more than your conscious experience, is that there's always somebody disappearing. That's what makes it very haunting, I think.
It's one of the few films I've ever seen that actually accurately depicts the feeling of losing relatives, of actually losing people in your life, when the actual process of death, which is always so dwelt upon in drama, because that's the dramatic part, right?
Right.
Is cut out entirely. And it's just, hey, they were here, now they're not, which, as you say, yeah, it makes it all the more haunting for not addressing it specifically.
Yeah, you just feel an absence because it isn't addressed. Nobody's talking about those people after they leave, right? And so you really feel the absence. I've got to say, the one other thing I love, this is partly my age too, is one of the funnier metaphorical moments in the film is Henry's medicine chest,
Yes.
where he's getting older, his body is handled by a dissolve to a lot more pills than the medicine chest. So it is also comic about the fact of aging.
Yeah. And the way too that, I mean, I do love the way that they deal with it in terms of even the makeup on Amishi. I actually watched that film the same evening as I watched The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, which has famously elaborate aging makeup and it's tremendous. But I almost feel like in Heaven Can Wait, we're not watching a literal representation of the lead character's aging. We're watching his self-image as he ages, where we're not meant to treat it as, hey, this is a literal depiction of the concrete process of aging. It's even in the literal makeup, it feels like a wink and a glance.
Can I offer another way of looking at it?
Yeah.
It's that he always remains the boy he is at the beginning of the narrative. That's, I think, again, where the casting of Amici makes the most sense. There is something boyish about him. Now, I'm glad to hear you're a Melvin Douglas fan, because I don't know if you've read Robin Wood's essay on silk stockings, where he talks about, which he prefers to Ninachka, which is
Really?
Yeah. And I like Wood's writing a lot. I knew him personally and liked him personally a lot, but I think, boy, this is the one line where he was just really wrong.
I love Sid Charisse.
Yes.
But she's no Greta Garbo.
No. And the anti-communist stuff. I mean, the thing I love about, actually, there's something else about Raphaelson that's interesting. The thing I love about Ninachka is the treatment of the communists in it. For the period and for later periods, it's actually, as Otis Ferguson wrote, it's the only movie that treats communists as human beings.
It doesn't ask Ninachka to relinquish her beliefs.
Yeah, no, not at all. And I love that the moment when they return to Moscow, the three friends are putting down life there, and she won't accept it, in a very nice way, but saying, that we have to look at how much we've done too. And I think the movie fully endorses that, which obviously Silk Stockings doesn't. But the thing I always disliked in Wood's article in Silk Stockings was he talks about her Garbo falling for the dubious charms of Melvin Douglas.
That guy's a charmer, I think.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think in both that and Angel, the one I have trouble with, which is, I don't even know if I want to call it least favorite, because I really just don't like it. I looked at Uncertain Feeling recently, and boy, do I not like that movie. If you have defenders on the show, that's fine. I'll be glad to hear it.
I can never do a full. It's one of his. It's a minor Lubitsch. I liked it a lot more than I thought. It's not great. It's as far as the late post-code, the Hayes era films we're discussing in the season that is to come. It's by a fair margin the one I have the least warm feeling towards. But I don't know. I'll defend Douglas in that film on one count. I think he's doing interesting things tonally. He's kind of playing against the material in interesting ways. But it doesn't fully work. I can't really muster up a raised fist for that film. So,
I thought, it's not much longer after, maybe it was the shooting. It's not much after the Ninachka, but I thought at that point that he wasn't aging well either. So I can't defend that. It was a very impressionistic response. It's royal thoughts on it.
I find that it's interesting seeing actors, this is a side note, but I find it interesting seeing actors age out of the sweet spot for that role that they were kind of born to play. I mean, it's interesting seeing Herbert Marshall in Angel for me, because he's kind of aged into the role he plays there. The alcoholism certainly contributed, but it's amazing how much he changed in the 5 years between Trouble in Paradise and that movie, where he's suddenly this noticeably more, not lumbering presence, but the light in his eyes has gone out a little.
No more stolid, I would say.
Yes.
And of course, in Duel in the Sun, he's quite dissolute.
Yes.
So that's appropriate to that role. So should we talk about 1 Hour with You?
Yeah, let's talk about Cuker and 1 Hour with You. You've mentioned a few anecdotes about that one.
Well, just one in particular is, and again, it's a similar thing of Lubitsch asking Raphaelson to look at something. And, that Lubitsch, for whatever reason, he did thoroughly prepare it and working with Raphaelson again, but for whatever reason, had decided not to direct it. I don't think it was more than a couple of weeks into the production. And he asked Rafe if he would come and look at some of the rushes with him, I think without saying much ahead of time. And Rafe looked at them and basically felt they were terrible. And he didn't explain more of what specifically he didn't like. And Lubitsch said, I don't know what to do. He'd gone down to the set and tried to make some suggestions in the direction and so on and so forth. But finally decided that he just would have to remove him and reshoot what they had done. And so the film is entirely his. Now, Cuker did, I guess, sue to get some kind of credit in the final film and was not happy. So that's the basic story on that where Raphaelson was involved, and probably because he was the screenwriter. What I find now, and looking back on this, I've been reading a lot of Raphaelson's plays, most of them, though, that were produced, is that Young Love, which was moderately successful comedy, made a year or so before that, was directed by George Cukor on the stage. And in telling the stories, Raphaelson never gave me any indication that he not only knew Cukor before this film, but actually had a relationship with him in the production of one of his plays. So I'm not sure what to make of that, but I found that kind of curious.
Oh, that's fascinating, because this was a actual setback in Cukor's career. I'm curious as to whether, because this is unknowable at this point, as to whether Rafe elided that little detail out of deference and respect to Cukor, or whether there might have been some sort of part of the whole, whether they got both caught out in that whole falling out that happened.
I don't know. I mean, the only other thing I could say is that he might not have liked what Cukor did. The play is kind of an interesting play because it's an odd play. It has only 4 characters, a younger couple and an older couple. And the young couple at the beginning of the play have just had sex for the first time. They're passionately in love, but they're looking at the older couple who seem a little more jaded, I'd say. They enter into this strange pact that they should have sex with somebody else and get all that out of their systems before they get married. And then what happens in the twist of it is that the woman, it is interesting, it really is very much a play of its period with a lot of the sexual liberation of the 20s. And yeah, it's 28. It was in 28. It's the woman actually has sex with the man of the older couple, and the husband is supposed to go after the wife. I mean, her future husband is supposed to go after the wife, but he can't go through with it. And she does, but she feels bad about it because this kind of complication where it definitely makes their continuing relationship kind of difficult. It all works out in the end. It is a comedy. The Times review of it, I haven't seen any other reviews. I think in general, the Times theater reviewers did not like Raphaelson, as far as I can tell. I've looked at a lot of reviews. And unfortunately for him, New York at that point had 8 daily newspapers. So you get 5 favorables and 3 negatives and still get a decent run of a few months. But the Times review talked about how it was farce and became increasingly farcical as the play went on. And I could see a way in which that might have been, for Rafe, a problem of direction. For him, there was something serious going on in this play. It was still a comedy, but if you push it towards farce, you might be losing some of the more serious emotion of it. So that's the only thing I can say. It's actually possible that he wasn't happy with what Cukor did with the play. I don't know, because I just find it odd that he never mentioned that he actually knew Cukor professionally before that.
Well, I'm sure there's a lot to that story that we have no way of ever knowing, unfortunately, now.
The only other thing I would actually mention is sort of crossing influences between his plays and the Lubitsch films, because he actually did use a number of actors from Lubitsch films in his plays, so that Miriam Hopkins is a lead performer in The Perfect Marriage in the late 40s. And on a minor level, Tom Tully is the pal of Felix Bressart in To Be or Not to Be, the one who plays Hitler. He apparently, I know from all the reviews I read on it, I didn't realize this, that Tom Tully was actually known primarily for his stage Irish characters. And that's the way Raphaelson then uses him in a play after To Be or Not to Be. And that conventional Tom Tully role is a sort of somewhat bibulous Irish blowhard. And on the other hand, this actually became a play called Jason. In the same play, there was a new actress who never appeared on Broadway before, who actually kind of became an overnight star from her performance in Jason, in Raphaelson's play Jason. And it's Helen Walker. And although she got great reviews, rather than continuing to work on Broadway, she got a Hollywood contract and left for Hollywood. Had some starring parts for a while and then started getting pushed into second lead roles. Is it Betty Cream? She's the character that...
Yeah, in Clooney Brown.
Yeah, she's the character that Helen Walker plays, the secondary female in that. I'm sure that Lubitsch was aware of her because of Jason.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting cross currents that in their careers that go back and forth.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense in the sense that you're going to be aware of who's working with your collaborators. And I mean, this is how, as a filmmaker, in my own small way, this is how we find the artists you work with.
Yeah, definitely.
A lot of the time. The origin of the Lubitsch touch, and not the Lubitsch touch itself, but the phrase, the etymology of the Lubitsch touch, the branding exercise, the phrase that is often associated with Ernst Lubitsch. And you just mentioned to me that you have some new thoughts on that. And I would love to hear that, because there's kind of, even in all my homework I've done for this show, which is probably pales in comparison to other people's homework, I still remain fuzzy on this subject.
Well, what I want to do that I don't think has been done before is look at this in terms of the history of theater. By that, I mean live performance theater, which of course is where Lubitsch begins his career, and working with Max Reinhardt. The important thing to keep in mind is the rise of the director in the late 19th century, which is to say that in the past, when plays were performed, obviously you had to have some level of direction because you don't want people running into each other on the stage. If you had more than 2 or 3 characters, you wanted to make sure that people were in the right place for the proper delivery. But this was both a combination of a group effort, and if there was a leading actor in the top role, he or she would be more or less responsible for telling people where to be. It's not unlike, and I think something was happening in music at the same time in the late 19th century, the rise of the conductor as an important figure in music performance, because before that, it was most often the first violinist would be responsible of keeping everybody on the same place in the music. Again, there was kind of direction, but it wasn't really a term until the late 19th century. And it's the rise of the star director that takes place in that period, in which the function, the activity, and the function of the director becomes an important part in Western theater, both in Europe and then in the US. And in terms of Europe, you have the rise of these star directors. Most relevant for us is Max Reinhardt was one. And in the United States, the rise of David Belasco. So what was happening then, because people were very aware of the director, and the fascinating thing for me, looking at theater reviews in the teens, people basically needed a term, needed a vocabulary for describing what the director does, because unlike the actors, you couldn't see the director. And so what exactly do the director do? And you'll get things, people talk about stage business and stuff like that. But most commonly, the term that is used to describe the director over and over again is his or hers touch.
Mm-hmm.
That the director has a touch that you can feel, and they could be quite specific about what they were. So if I can read, if you don't mind this.
Oh, naturally.
This is mostly some theater reviews or articles in the teens. This last one is actually from a book on theater and 1921 about David Belasco. In all of his productions, Belasco has held the guiding hand. That's another thing. They'll use the word hand, the guiding hand. Then in the New York Times review from 22, in a particular play directed by Belasco, it is adorned, it is tricked out, it is dressed up in 100 little ways with the minute things and the deft touches that goes to make the play real. This is a thing related to Reinhardt. It is a production in New York, but about Max Reinhardt came to New York a number of times to put on productions that he gave in Germany. So this is actually a kind of criticism of it. But Sophocles has not enough horror for Dr. Max Reinhardt. Such a touch as this, having an actor exit through the audience. I'm interpolating that from the article. But such a touch as this tended to give a melodramatic horribleness to the great tragedy. So that's a panning of the touch. And then the last one, in the play Broadway, the details were attended to and marked with marked thoroughness. These touches were noticed and talked about by most of those who saw the director, Judd Harris. Okay, so those are all about plays. Now, it wasn't surprising if you consider that in this period, so in the teens, as movies are moving from the short films to feature films and explicitly emulating theater, they saw themselves as a form of theater for the masses that could, albeit without sound, could bring Broadway-level productions across the country and even in the smallest town. Considering that more and more they were looking at film as if it were theater, it's not surprising that this is well before auteurism, that the criticism of the teens and 20s often elevates the director above all other contributors to film. So And this is actually from a DeMille film from 1919. Its claimed influence, Lubitsch. The comedy of it all is richly human, always in good taste, full of those delicate touches of business which give reality to a work of art while enhancing its delicacy and beauty. Another one, Stuart Blackton, who's a pretty well-known director from this period. Blackton considered carefully what he was doing. The result is a consistently developed photoplay that always holds the interesting, frequent displays, touches above the average. Another one, Henry Darrost, well-known director of the period. One is constantly reminded of the director's fertile imagination. Nothing happens just so. There is a different touch, which makes an incident all the more interesting. And then finally, what counts in the picture is that the merely conventional thing has been avoided. The director, Montabell, has kept the picture from being a stereotype. One of the methods of doing this is to be constantly inventing little human touches. So those are all those things. Now, in terms of Lubitsch, then, it's not at all surprising that people would talk about his touch because they were talking about all the other directors this way in both theater and movies. But beyond that, there is a specific person that has a strong influence on Lubitsch in this regard, and I think has an impact on the development of the term the Lubitsch touch, and that's Charlie Chaplin. And one of the things that's significant, and I don't think I've seen anybody else say this, so I want to say it, that's important with Chaplin's early work and features was the making of A Woman in Paris, which is famously the one Chaplin film in which he did not appear. And I think there are interesting parallels to Lubitsch in this regard. I think one of the reasons that Chaplin decided to make a movie in which he would not appear, and he was always, he was sure box office. So in terms of if he was looking for financial success, not appearing in the movie was not a good idea. The reason that he had for making this film was he was becoming increasingly ambitious in his films. And if you look at the short films, as he moves from studio to studio with each short film and takes over direction in something like the eighth or ninth film that he makes, Keystone, he's becoming increasingly ambitious as a filmmaker, not just as a performer in the show. And I think then the thing that he realized, because he was, Chaplin had certainly fairly large ego and wanted recognition for his art. He was highly recognized for his art as a performer. But in terms of his ambition as a director, I think he understood that he would not get that recognition unless he didn't appear and made a movie in which he didn't appear. And that's the function of A Woman in Paris in his career. And sure enough, if you look at the reviews of Woman in Paris, what are people talking about? Talking about ways in which Chaplin is felt throughout the movie, even if he doesn't appear in it. Mm. And how is he felt? He's felt through the Chaplin touch. So here are some examples of this from contemporary reviews of A Woman in Paris. All the ingredients of the popular type of movie are there, but they have been touched by the hand of a master. It is amazingly original in style. After the description of the final sequence, he writes, there are many other realistic touches such as this throughout the picture. Another example. Chaplin's production is epic-making in technique and treatment. There are a multitude of clever touches in the action. It is sophisticated and ultra-modern vein. Last one. The story is not an unusual one, but the handling of it gives it a marvelous depth and charm. Chaplin shows himself on this production to be a sort of O. Henry of the silent drama. The interesting and pleasant touches in the various scenes are like simple words used by an author to give spark and life to his story. So I would say two things. Obviously, Lubitsch is aware of it. One of the things that is distinctive about Lubitsch is that his style calls attention to itself in various ways by its departure from conventional Hollywood style. I agree with Kristen Thompson that he moves towards that, but as soon as he arrives at it, I think he begins to depart. So that one of the reasons people began to talk about the Lubitsch touch, number one, it was a way to talk about what directors did in movies. But number two, in a way, to use the terminology of the period, Lubitsch's style is always showing his hand. It is forefront in terms of style in a way that made even relatively unsophisticated newspaper reviewers aware that this was somebody behind the camera doing something that they could see. And so it's really not until, I think Kristen finds an example in 25 or 26, but it's really not until the early 30s that the Lubitsch touch becomes commonplace. It becomes a commonplace in reviews of his films. And that's the period in which he seems on the most extreme version of departures from conventional style.
Where I'd love to hear more about this is in the specific ways that maybe certain films exhibit this, because we discussed before recording Trouble in Paradise as a good example of where, that film is often discussed in the context of, okay, here is where kind of a lot about Lubitsch's style congealed. And because Lubitsch is so closely associated with classical Hollywood realism, that's often seen as, okay, that's where Lubitsch started to, or, maybe finally arrived at this singularity of classical Hollywood aesthetics, right? But really, Trouble in Paradise breaks from it in a lot of very key ways.
Yeah, it does. But if I can, again, approach it historically, I think I want to begin a little earlier.
Please do. I would much prefer that.
Okay. What Kristen does is, in showing how Lubitsch's style is developing through the German period, is terrific. And that how he moves towards that Hollywood style of continuity cutting that is influenced by American films that he saw in Germany. And what the result is that she says, with Rosita, there's a quote from Kristen, his films probably contain no more continuity errors than did those of American trained directors, and probably fewer than many. And I think that's true enough, except for the fact that he began to challenge it almost immediately with the next film, The Marriage Circle. Now, I'll get to that in a minute because I want to point out one of the things that he does. In The Marriage Circle, I think he introduces deliberate discontinuities into the system. It's like there is something maybe a little, at times, anarchic in Lubitsch, and that he follows the rules and then he breaks the rules. Or he follows the rules in order to learn how to break them. And I want to say that actually, in one way, this begins with Rosita itself, because it's in Rosita that I think you always have to be very careful about saying the first example of something or other. It's often possible to find exceptions. But he does something in Rosita that then becomes, which he does even more extremely in The Marriage Circle, but becomes a kind of constant thing for him. If you say that the Hollywood continuity system always works by establishing a coherent space that you then cut into following certain rules that conform to continuity. That is, you can't put people on the wrong side of the screen and so on and so forth on the cutting. Everything always has to stay in the same place. And that you establish that place with the opening shot. What's the opening shot of Rosita? The opening shot of Rosita is a close-up of hands. And it's the hands playing this game with the king and the 3 or 4 women that he has surrounding him. And you don't really know what's going on exactly, except that they're playing some kind of game. And it's only when you cut back that you get a sense, and I think it cuts back to something like a medium shot, so you can then see all the people. But you still haven't located the entire space, and it's only subsequent to that he locates the entire space, and you now actually have a full understanding of what's going on. So in other words, what he's doing is he's forcing the audience with the opening shot. It's not the simple thing of leading people into an action by looking at it as a whole and then moving into it, but he reverses the procedure, turns it inside out, and in effect, forces the audience to think a little bit about what they're watching. Well, what exactly is going on in this opening shot? Right? So that's one of the ways that, in fact, he's turned it upside down, the continuity system. The next one is with Marriage Circle. And there's a lot of specific things, but the obvious place to begin is, again, with the opening, which is done through a series of close-ups. But it begins with close-up of Adolf Manju.
Yes.
Who looks at his sock, and you have the insert shot of his sock and has the hole in the toe. And you don't know that there's anybody else in the room with him until he looks off to a indeterminate space. And the image then cuts to Marie Prevost on the other side of the room. And she's doing something. We can't locate them spatially except to say that we know he's looking at her. So we have a sense of she's on whatever, she's to his right, I would guess, and so on and so forth. And it goes through that in a couple of ways where the only way the sequence of shots makes sense is because of the characters' responses to each other in glimpses. I think it's not until the 5th or 6th shot that we see the entire space. So again, we're forced to construct something. We are asked to construct something and infer people often use the word inference to describe Lubitsch's styles. He's constantly forcing us to infer things. Well, one of the ways he forces us to infer things is by withholding obvious information that we would have otherwise. And what the inference is about this obviously failed marriage and the two different ways that each character has of looking at the other with some level of disgust. And it makes that prominent rather than making the space in which they inhabit important. If we looked at this in a conventional Hollywood, the first thing we would know was something about the wealth, the status of the couple because of the environment that they live in. Only progressively move into what the nature of the relationship was. This is the way that he makes that prominent, makes that primary, and runs counter to the classical style in doing.
I think one could maybe describe the difference between I don't want to say discontinuity, but the departures from classical continuity here versus when thrown into relief against his work in Germany, is that in Germany, it often felt like that when he would depart from later ideas of classical continuity, it wasn't so much that he was departing from it, it's that those concepts weren't a governing factor, right? I love that there's that little snowball fight in Romeo and Juliet in the Snow where every single cut breaks the axis, we might call it, right? And that doesn't feel like Lubitsch consciously going, I know there's an axis, let me break it, but as here's two shots and they relate in ways that are self-evident, the axis is not a dimension that is being thought of. Whereas, for example, in his work that we're talking about, The Marriage Circle or Trouble in Paradise or The Merry Widow, where he is playing games with continuity, he is, in those cases, consciously departing from a precept that is kind of a governing factor through every other decision, right? So it's not that he is simply reverting back to his Berlin self. It is that he is now engaging in a sort of thoughtful departure from the norm, whereas that was not going on in Berlin.
I agree completely. It's as he masters it, his upending it is now a kind of conscious decision. There's a nice thing, I don't want to use this, I don't want to create marital strife, but there's a nice thing that David Bordwell writes about Lady Windermere's fan, in which he notices an anomaly in an eye-line match. Although this is often taken as one of the most perfect versions of the classical style. I have the passage from David here. It's the sequence in which Lady Windermere has become suspicious about her husband's relationship to Madame Hélène. There is evidence in the form of checks that he's written to her in the husband's desk. And as she's suspicious, she goes in the room of the husband's office and circles around the desk. And let me say, because I really like the way David uses a phrase here that I love, attached to Lubitsch more generally. Let me just read the way he says this. Kristen Thompson describes Windermere's Fan as the film where Lubitsch attains utter mastery of continuity editing, singly, as others have done, the reverse sequence of point-of-view shots that anchor the racetrack scene in the film. He goes on to describe the scene in which she approaches the desk from the left and then hesitates about whether or not to open the drawer and look at the checkbook. As she's looking at the drawer, we get an insert shot of the drawer from the right. In other words, it's at the wrong angle and is a complete and total violation because she's on the left. She should be looking to the right. When I say it's from the right, it's the camera is looking at the desk towards the left, right? So it's on the wrong side. And then she hesitates, and then something even stranger happens. Is she walks out of the image on the right that is behind the camera and then reappears on the right side of the image. That is that she's walked completely behind the camera and looks at the desk again from that side, at which point she'll open the drawer. I actually see something similar at the end of Angel, but we can come back to that. The other thing that's important to say is the camera lingers on the desk long enough for us to wonder where she's gone. She simply walked out of frame and left the image and left the scene. But Bordwell notes, if she decides to return to the desk, we would expect her to enter from the foreground left. But instead, he says, she darts in from the rear from off-screen right, which means that she's passed behind the camera. And he adds so much for the ideal observer if the character can sneak behind its back. So that also is a kind of violation, right, of the continuity cutting, because it implies there's a camera watching this. If Lubitsch were a modernist, and I know that David would say he was burying the device, borrowing a term from Russian formalism that David likes quite a bit. However, what Bordwell says instead is that he sees this as charming mischief. He's content to call it charming mischief, albeit powerful mischief. For me, the charm lies in the usual Lubitsch manner of a foregrounding style instead of just charming mischief. But I like the phrase for Lubitsch because I think he's always mischievous, what he's doing with this. And that it becomes a way, I think, of commenting on Lady Windermere's hesitation and difficulty in opening that drawer. I mean, it's a way of foregrounding the character's emotion. And I think a lot of this is often about making us see something about character that we would not see otherwise. So I think that's when you can see that in a lot of these earlier, as these films more and more are making mischief, to borrow David's terms. Lubitsch said he regarded Trouble in Paradise as his greatest exercise in style. And so we might say it's the film in which he makes the most mischief in playing with the style.
Are there any particular moments that exemplify this for you? I have a couple in mind for myself, but I'm more curious about yours.
Well, I mean, I think it's practically everything from the very beginning of the film. I mean, the beginning of the film is kind of mysterious on exactly what's going on, right? Is we just see the shadow movie. So it's the Edward Horton character falling over, the shadow moving across the wall, and so on and so forth. So from the very beginning, Lubitsch is presenting the material in a sufficiently indirect way that we have to some degree, try to construct the action, exactly what the action is in our own minds. So from the very beginning of the movie, it's presented as a little bit of a puzzle as well. And beyond that, I don't know, it's like practically every sequence in the movie would apply. So I'm happy to take anything that you want to suggest.
There's one moment in Trouble in Paradise in particular that stuck out at me in my most recent viewing. And that's when Monesquieu, Herbert Marshall, and Collet, Kay Francis, are first meeting and he's returning her handbag. And there's a moment in which we cut to Edward Everett Horton in a totally different scene. Very briefly, he's jauntily walking. Within the context of the scene, Lubitsch gives you so little in the way of connective tissue for those two sequences that I was wondering, even after having seen it too many times to count, I was wondering, wait, why did we cut to that? And then that is later answered when he shows up with the
handbag.
Well, that leaves you holding the bag.
There's a sufficient amount of time that's passed since the moment when we see him at the store looking to buy the handbag and that cut there, that the connective tissue, where in most films, Hitchcock would probably urge any director to make every single shot become self-explanatory to justify its own existence immediately. Every scene change, you never want to unmoor your audience beyond the creation of tension, productive tension. But in this case, it is a cut away that is so fast and so context-free that I went, wow, that ruptures my sense of what that shot is there for. It almost feels like it's placed there more just a little punctuation as a way to cut away from the scene to add a little bit of momentum, comic energy to it than it is to describe to us, the audience, yes, Edward Everett Horton had to walk down the street to get from point A to point B. You don't need that shot.
Well, punctuation isn't necessarily a bad idea. You know what? I think it's like something else that happens later in the film. But let's say what I think it does at this point is it sets up our sense, finally, ultimately it's more important for the scene into which it's cut than that it's cut. It set up our sense of a progress, a progression in the development of what's going on between Gaston and Mariette. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that because I actually have also a different way of thinking about it. There's many ways in which Gaston is being very seductive with her in that scene, as he is throughout that sequence. It's what culminates in his being hired. You can say he's being seductive with her in a transitional way because it helps him to get what he wants, which is the money for the bag. But there's another way, by putting Philibert into the middle of that. It reminds us of the power that Mariette has over men. And because those two foppish suitors are so much her inferior that she has no trouble manipulating them and controlling them. And of course, a lot of her power lies in her money, which is what Gaston is there for, so that he could think he's in the power position because doing something that's quite illicit. He stole the bag and now he's returning it for the money, but she's actually in the power position. And I think this relates to something that, I write about in the book, I think is worth emphasizing. This can offer a kind of preview of coming attractions for my sense of the way laughter works in Lubitsch too, is if you think of the way the scene finally ends, where Gaston lectures her on her lipstick and so on and so forth, he says, if I were your father, I would give you a good spanking. Unfortunately, I am not.
In a business sort of way, yeah.
In a business sort of way, yeah. Thank you. Unfortunately, I am not. And she says, well, what would you do if you were my secretary? And she says the same. And then the thing I love, and Frances is wonderful at this moment, I think, too, the way she looks at him, it's a slight look of shock, or at least maybe at the first line about the spanking. But she looks at him and then leans back against the wall in that very sensuous way.
You're hired.
You're hired. And says you're hired, which is the big laugh, right? And, I think it's very similar. She is leaning back as she says that. She's putting herself in the seemingly passive position, but she's very active. She's the one who's controlling, and he's talking about giving her a spanking, but she's the one who's controlling it.
Yeah, she has the power to hire him at the end of the day.
She has the power to hire him. And then I think the other thing that goes with that, just as a sort of thinking ahead of it, it's a funny line. People laugh. Do we really think about the whole sadomasochistic thing that's just been involved?
Yes.
Or is laughter a way of deflecting that thought? We can come back to that. In any case, that's, one thing. The other thing that's obvious is where Lubitsch is not conventional style. I've written about this extensively in the chapter in the Lubitsch book on Trouble, is the first night that Gaston and Mariette spend together, which we see entirely through clocks. This is not a conventional way to shoot that scene.
Oh, you don't say.
But again, it's a thing. Why were people talking about the Lubitsch touch, especially in this period? Well, you knew this is not the way people normally do things, right? That it's the way in which the style, I think, especially in this period, it gets a little calmer in the late 30s, but especially in this period, the style is always foregone in various ways. And that is not classical style. And I've said this elsewhere, actually, I said it in my last book, that there is no way in that final scene second-to-last scene between Gaston and Mariette, she decides to go out for the evening. And she says, oh, Gaston, we have weeks, months, years to stay together, right? And on each one of those shots, on that phrase, it's a 5 or 6 word sentence. There's 3 different shots, starting with, it's actually 4 altogether, but starting with when she says it, and she says weeks, you see a shot of them in one mirror, months, you see a shot of them in another mirror, and then years, and you see a shot of the shadows on the bed. Now, when I've taught that film, and students always love that, taught the film, everybody thinks about, the sexual implications of the shadows on the bed. What I'm interested in is the fact that the shadows.
Yes.
It's effervescent. It's not going to last. That's right. It's become something representing something that's very concrete and physical has become something that's almost intangible. What Lubitsch is constantly doing here, and I think this thing does trace back to his earlier films and some of the German films. There is a strong metaphorical quality to Lubitsch's style that becomes more and more foregrounded in this period, so that the clocks work as a metaphor. To establish the first night together through clocks, there is a idea here around a kind of temporality associated with the love affair that is being articulated strictly in the images. There is a kind of poetry in Lubitsch, in this metaphorical quality that I think is already there in the German films, but becomes more and more pronounced after he moves to Hollywood, and the style becomes more and more overt in certain ways.
I'd be curious to hear about, on this kind of side note here, how this focus on the temporality and the implicit implication of death in all of this. I've seen for quite some time that moment in Trouble in Paradise. The shadows imply a temporality, but they also imply a sort of a death, right? It's a very funereal moment. I was particularly taken with your application of this idea to the Merry Widow. It's simultaneously, I think, in my opinion at least, maybe his most exuberant film. It's just one of the most joyous works in cinema for me. But it's also a film where death and the specter of past death and eventual death are omnipresent, and especially in the second half.
Yeah, I know it is the most overt in Merry Widow. I mean, I think I refer to it as a kind of dance of death at the end. And this is rewritten. One of the interesting things is that the speech is rewritten in the Merry Widow at the trial, which gives rise to the final sequence where Danilo says, any man
who can dance through life with hundreds of women and is willing to walk through life with one should be hanged.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's in the final version. But what was interesting, they had to change the original line that Raphaelson wrote. And in my copy of the Raphaelson script, it's actually still the original line, which is, he says, any man that would go through life with dozens of women, but was willing to have only one. It didn't use the dance metaphor. And the code was not happy with that. This is something that must have been reshot because it's, as I said, it's in the Raphaelson script. They had to change the line. And what's typical of Lubitsch is in order to make it sound less overtly sexual the way the original line did, he replaces it with a metaphor. I think it's wonderful that he replaced the line. I think the PCA did him real value in telling him he had to change the line because it plays into the whole role of dance in the movie, and which I think is important. There's no dance in the first half of the film. There's a lot more in the second half.
And conversely, very little singing in the second half, too.
Yeah. There's music from the operetta that doesn't appear. I can't remember if I mentioned that during the Raphaelson.
You did actually, yeah. You mentioned specifically that there is even songs that were originally slated for the film that were cut, but the background music from those songs sneaks into other scenes in the movie.
Right. And when I asked Raphaelson about it, he just said that was Lubitsch. That Lubitsch would have dictated that. So the importance of dance for the second half of the film. And then, in the opposition between Maxime's and the embassy ball, is Maxime's, the dance is almost chaotic. It's just constant movement, and the image is filled with those ruffled skirts circular skirts going around, kind of stuff. Whereas the dance at the embassy ball is very formal, but they also keep being impinged upon by the crowd until they finally are lost in the crowd, right? There's a kind of death that takes place there as well. So the dance metaphor becomes extended throughout that second half, and then fully then realizes, I think, beautifully in that thing where the Merry Widow waltz starts playing. And of course, the Merry Widow waltz itself invokes death, right? It's about the widow. And they circle around each other, sort of half walking, half dancing. It's the sort of the culmination of the dance theme throughout the movie. As you know, I've been thinking a lot about Lubitsch in ways I hadn't in the past. And the one thing I've thought about a great deal is the ways in which the endings of his film often undercut in some subtle ways the apparent resolutions of the film. That's obviously true in Merry Widow because of the equation of marriage with death. But I think it's in the other films as well. There seems to be a return to normal at the end of Trouble in Paradise as Lily and Gaston repeat their playful seduction of each other in the opening sequence by the mutual thefts. On the other hand, we have that last image the image of Mariette facing the door as Gaston walks out on her. We see her from back when her body is just seems to be full of emotion, the devastation of having him walk out on her. And she sort of returns to herself when Gaston walks in, and she gives him the pearls with the compliments of Gaston, of Delay and Company. But can we ever lose that image of the devastation of Mariette? And the fact that, and I think this is the other thing that's important, is that it's important to see I keep insisting on this. Everybody else I've read sort of counters it, that the triangle is equilateral, that he is as much in love with Mariette as he is with Lily. And I think it's critical to see that so that the ending is not, we've come full circle, but the ending is not quite where we were at the beginning of their relationship, because it has been disturbed by the fact of this other love.
Yeah. And I mean, it's been disturbed on the account of both parties, right? Because Gaston has been disturbed by falling in love with someone else simultaneously, and Lily's trust has been disturbed. So there's a sense that this is cyclical in their relationship. It'll definitely never be the same as it once was. It's left totally open. Taxi ride into the dark, which, as usual for Lubitsch, has a very ambivalent signification.
Yeah. So I think that in terms of the later films, the two I really had in one way, or was thinking about again a lot. Obviously with Ninotchka's, you tend to think of, in terms of the resolution of a romantic comedy, it's the couple gets together. So Ninotchka and Leon get together at the end. But it's not the last scene.
Mm-hmm.
The last scene is a scene of discord, right? It's a way of saying that a lot of the issues that have come up in the movie have not been resolved, even if the love relationship has. But the one that intrigues me the most, and I thought about a lot, and I had to do some kind of odd research on, is the ending of Shop Around the Corner, which in many ways is one of the sweetest movies that Lubitsch made. It's probably my desert island Lubitsch, if I had to take just one. I think it's one of the most perfectly acted movies I have ever seen, period. I will tell you that this was not quite preparation, but I decided it was time. I finally brought myself around to looking at You've Got Mail.
Oh, no.
Which I had never wanted to do. When I started watching, I said, okay, she's really making it something different, and that's okay. Right? And it's not a basic remake. She found a way of making an opposition between the two, in terms of a business, the growth of the big bookstore chains versus small independent bookstore operators.
The evil Barnes and Noble.
Right. Or at Borders at that time, especially too.
Yeah.
And of course, Borders has now gone under. I mean, what she couldn't have anticipated is that the independent bookstores have staged a bit of a comeback in the interval. And I think one of the things that's wrong with the second half is that Meg Ryan gives up too easily. Maybe I can say that with the knowledge that independent bookstores have actually had a comeback. But okay, it's an okay way to do it. The problem with it is that it has nothing to do with the characters of each of those two people. They're opposed to each other basically for external reasons. And that's where the plot really runs into problems, which is why, in terms of getting them to finally acknowledge each other, well, basically what they have to do is kill her store, and then that she gives up, basically, and then they can get together, because there was nothing that really separated them to start off, except these external factors. Is that he represented big capitalism, she represented small capitalism, and she lost. And, it's interesting, the one scene that actually does take Raphaelson verbatim is
the very middle of the film.
Is the very middle.
Yeah.
I think that scene comes later in Shop Around the Corner. The other thing that happens is the second half is suddenly the song score takes over obsessively, because the characters have nothing left to say to each other. So she handles all these things with these songs, and I guess it's awful. Anyway, getting back to, there's one way this is relevant to Shop Around the Corner. I will tell you what interests me about the ending. I find very odd, and in one way it throws us back into the movie, is the thing where, they finally resolve things between each other, and Margaret Sullivan it's a wonderful line. I can't do it exactly about.
Or psychologically, I'm very confused, but personally, I feel just fine.
Yeah. No, it's a great line.
Yeah.
Better line than anything in You've Got Mail. But then she brings up, she still wants to ask about
his bow legs.
Mr. Crowlake said, is he bowlegged? And she asks about that. Oh, it was a terrible thing to say, but
Yeah.
You cut to the shot, he lifts his pants, and then cut back to them. She says, darling, and they embrace. I am very interested. The thing that got me intrigued is as he lifts his pants, we don't just see that he's not bow-legged. We also see that he uses sock garters.
Yes.
And that's something that intrigued me. How many, and I wanted to look at other 30s movies to see how many men wear sock garters in films of that period. So I actually got 2 points of reference. One was I thought I would look at You Can't Take It With You because of Clark Gable's striptease. You don't see his legs, you don't see his pants. But when he carries Claudette Colbert across the stream, he rolls up his pants leg first, and he does not have sock garters on. Even more relevant, in Bluebeard's Eighth Wife, Gary Cooper at one point appears in boxer shorts and socks. He does not have sock garters. Okay, so why am I concerned with this? I think it points to something. This is one of the other key differences with You Got Mail, is that all of the people that we're paying attention to, with the exception of Frank Morgan, are workers. They all work in the store. There's a hierarchy of difference that is much more extreme in You've Got Mail, because you have the guy from big business who's very powerful, and the small businesswoman can't stand in his way. But in the original, they're all basically on the same level, with a social hierarchy within that level. Is that Kralik is at the head of the group because he's the favored person. He's the manager of the store for Matichuk. But otherwise, they are equal, and there is this competition between the two of them. The hostility between the two is partly about the social and cultural ambitions that they both have, right? And that's what sets them at each other. Or as she put it at the end,
I didn't realize that the difference between this glamorous lady and me was that she was with the Comédie Française and I was with Matichuk and Company.
It's a kind of come down. She understands what her position in life is, and so that a kind of acquiescence, a losing of those ambitions, is necessary for both of them to begin to acknowledge the other.
And I think that's the essential element that I feel is most missing from You Got Mail, where in Shop Around the Corner, it's about two ambitious and also pretentious people who want to improve their station in life, but also I think their self-image is divorced from who they actually are, right? Or at least they have kind of two personalities, right? Like Kralik, the grumpy...
Which means rabbit in some way.
Kralik, the rather grumpy, slightly resentful middle manager, and Kralik, the man of letters who wants to converse on cultural subjects. And you have the same dynamic within Margaret O'Sullivan's character. And in that film, it's two people coming to terms, or almost reconciling these two identities within themselves and coming to peace with that. And You've Got Mail, I can't really come up with an analog because I don't think there is one.
No, there isn't. They don't meet on any common level at all. They're also kind of non-characters in many ways.
Yeah, it's Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan.
Yeah. So why am I interested in the garters? Because I think it throws us back to the middle of the movie and articulating Kralik's pretension. It is something that would be worn by people who have a certain kind of ambition towards higher class, right?
He wants to be a gentleman.
He wants to be a gentleman, right? He always dresses properly, and so on. So I think there are ways in which a lot of the films end up throwing us back into the middle of the movie and just a little bit untie what seems to have been resolved. Now, if we want to get out to the most extreme version of that, is probably Angel. Obviously, with Angel, there's a couple of things. It's the film that most challenged the code after the PCA was in force. It's a property that had knocked around for a while. I think it was Universal. Oh, John Stahl was interested in filming Universal in the early 30s, and they had taken an option on the play. And the play is much more explicit and much more comedy than the film is. But Lubitsch was obviously even just taking this on, and from the beginning, the PCA had concerns about it because they had already rejected the play out of hand. And it was only Lubitsch's reputation that made them sort of give a tentative, well, let's see what you got when you do the screenplay. There were some things that did get impacted on by the code. Let's say most of it was around the opening sequence, which is setting up the love affair between Maria, and the Melvin Douglas character. But the opening sequence was problematic because of the not too failed suggestion that it was a house of assignation.
Yes.
To use a phrase that Joseph Breen referred to, Maxime's as a house of assignation itself in Merry Widow. And so that was obviously a concern. There was one in the Raphaelson shooting script. I know there were some reshoots, and there was also a lot, I think about 1,000 feet of film was cut from the final version. The thing that made it really obvious was a moment in which a woman comes up to Laura Hope Cruz, to the Duchess, the Grand Duchess, and wants to sell her some jewelry. I think it's Arians, whatever, and she won't buy it. There's no dialogue because it is all done silently. One of the ways Lubitsch thought he could get away with it was keeping it silent by looking at it through windows.
Cameras through a window, yeah.
But she refused to buy it, but instead brings her over to a man, one of the men at the bar, and introduces her. And, and that's that. So it was pretty obvious. It made it pretty close to prostitution, not just the house of assignation, that she could solve her money problems by getting involved with this guy. That's what's in the original screenplay, Raphaelson shooting script. They redid it, I think. Probably the PCA clearly rejected it. So that in the final version, the Grand Duchess does write a check for the earrings. And then in the next window, you see her introducing another woman to a man. And so it sort of at least takes the money component away from the assignation, let's say the introduction that she's making at that point. But, it was pretty well understood, and even people at the time understood. So he was able to do what the PCA wanted, and they got away with it that way. The one thing they also had to change was the night that Tony, that's Merlin Douglas's character's name, Tony and Marie and Angel spent together. There's one point in which they're walking outside, and you see, this is in the screenplay, in the background, you see the illuminated sign that says hotel. They had to cut that shot. The PCA didn't want to have any suggestion of having a hotel. That could be inferred. That's where they were, because there's a kind of temporal ellipsis at one point. So those are the kinds of things that were censored. The film, it probably got some of the worst reviews of Lubitsch's song period. I mean, I think the worst possible thing for Lubitsch is some people found it just boring. I think going back to the Lubitsch touch, one of the things that turned up in a number of reviews is people would say, well, there's not very many Lubitsch touches in this. It's mostly connected to the servants. If you understand the Lubitsch touch as primarily a kind of comic and ironic way of looking at things, which I think is one understanding of it, yeah, I could see saying that. I think what people have forgotten, though, is that the other thing that happens is it's really, and I think I've said this to you before, it's really only in the sound period that Lubitsch becomes primarily a comic director. That he makes 9 films in the silent period, and only 4 of them are out-and-out comedies. One, I think it's fair to call Lady Windermere comedy drama, which was a term that was used for dramatic comedy. I think comedy drama was more common. It was a term that was applied to it at the time.
But yeah, you got Eternal Love, which is a straight drama. Not a very good one. You have Three Women, which I would not really classify as a comedy.
No, it's not at all. Not the least bit. I mean, it is out and out melodrama. I know it's Sabina Hacking refers to it as a comedy, but that doesn't make any sense to me at all.
And Student Prince I would not call that a comedy. That's at least a sweeping drama with a lot of comedy in it, I'd say. There's a lot of funny notes. So the majority of the films in that period weren't.
And The Patriot, well, we don't have The Patriot, but The Patriot's not a comedy.
I think we can safely say that.
Can I speak up for Eternal Love?
Yes, you can.
I was actually surprised by it. I haven't seen it probably in 40 years. I wanted, in thinking about this, I wanted to really rethink Lubitsch and look at some of the German films I hadn't seen, watch German films I hadn't seen in decades again, and anything else I hadn't seen in quite a while, I looked at again. Eternal Love was one of them. I actually found it more interesting than I anticipated. I'm going to suggest a kind of weird way of thinking about it. It's the tragic version of The Marriage Circle. It's the film in which he wrongly marries Marie Prevost instead of the true love, and everything that is terrible that comes out of that relationship.
So it's a version of Marriage Circle where it ends with them throwing themselves upon God's mercy.
Yeah. Anyway, I liked it better than I anticipated. That's all I can say.
Out of curiosity, were there any other kind of new thoughts you had on the German films in particular on this kind of most recent set of viewings that didn't occur to you before?
Well, there were some things. The one I like the best, I still like the best. And it's the only one I write about in the first one, Among the Epics, which is Anne Boleyn. And I still think that's the same for me. One of the thoughts that I had, outside of it, this kind of interesting bifurcation between out-and-out farce. He's not really doing romantic comedy in that period. What he's doing is farce that might have romantic comedy elements to them, but it is more farce. So that when he approaches comedy in the US, it's actually something different from what he did in Germany. I think that one of the things that interested me about it is, and that this is part of looking at the film stylistically, is that who the characters are at the beginning of these films is very much who they remain at the end. That is, it's the definition of character that you get often in the very first shot of them remains remarkably consistent throughout the film. And one of the things that happens in the US that I think is different is the characters start taking a degree of ambiguity that they didn't have in the German films. So one of the examples I use in the epics and the great historical or epic dramas is often the tragedy of the characters is that they don't change. So that one of the things, and I think this is the beginning of the use of close-up. I said that this actually does begin in something of a rudimentary way in some of the German films, but actually, no, it's not just because it's actually also in Oyster Princess, is that there are some films where he does have an opening close shot that is not fully contextualized by the setting.
Anne Boleyn is a great example of that.
Anne Boleyn is a great example of that because with both of the leading characters, with Anne, it's the shot of her, it's a close shot of her on the ship.
Yeah, dipping in and out of the frame, yeah.
Dipping in and out of the frame, and you can't explain it until you realize that she's on a ship, right?
Yeah.
Which we get after the fact. I mean, so this is looking ahead to what he starts doing very insistently in the American films. The introduction of Heinrich, in the German, is of a fairly close, I guess it's a close medium shot of him eating, and taking the thing and putting it to his mouth. And then you cut back and realize he's actually at the round table with all his knights and that they're all having a meal together. And in both cases, what I see in the German films that I don't think you have in the American films, so I find it interesting, is that those opening shots that are close become emblematic of who the character is. And actually, I've got to say, this is the one thing that knocked me out this time. I didn't remember this. I think Yanning's is terrific. It's just incredibly, incredibly good. I think it's the best thing he ever did. And, supposedly it had a big impact on Charles Lawton's version. But he's a man of appetites. Right. And he stays at it's like he can't help himself. He is that always a man of appetites.
Yeah.
Whereas Anne, by contrast, is somebody who's never able to control the situation she finds herself in.
She's acted upon. Yeah.
She's bobbing in and out of the frame, right? The situation is moving her. She tries to. I think the moment when she confronts with the woman who Henry is next moving on to, and she confronts her and makes her get in the carriage with her. And so, that she really tries to assert the authority that should be granted to her as queen, but she finally doesn't have the power. She finally can't control the course of events, much as she might. It's not initially a close-up. You don't get the full set, but the first shot in Madame de Barry of Jean and Negri is actually terrific in that too, I think. And you first hear with the two women on either side of her. And this is actually really anticipating something like the opening of Marriage Circle. You cut into a closer shot of her, and she's irrepressible. They're sort of talking animatedly, but then she starts to laugh, and she just is this kind of exuberant, outgoing, irrepressible person. And then you cut back, and we still don't have the full space established. But the head of the milliner's shop tells her basically to be quiet and do your work. And you cut back to her, and she tries to hold in the laugh, but she can't.
Yeah.
Right? And that's the key definition of her character. She cannot repress desire ever. She can tell her true love that he really is her true love, and she believes it. But she also can't repress desire for other men. That becomes her tragedy. And I think in these films, those traits remain constant throughout the films. I think there's a little more ambiguity and mystery that develops in the later movies.
It's interesting seeing in the same way that Lubitsch, his touch not being exclusively comic, you can see it everywhere at least I think in his more successful Berlin dramas. But maybe the best example of this is in something like Broken Lullaby too, wherein a lot of the quote touches that we most commonly associate with his comic films are used for purely dramatic. That film has very little mirth. For purely dramatic ends, you have the same kind of misunderstandings, inference, the use of doors even. The play with languages that we associate with films like To Be or Not to Be is there too. It's the same devices calibrated towards a totally different tonal effect. And I think this should tell us as well as anything that the things that make him Lubitsch are not fundamentally comic things.
No.
It's just that he was, I think, particularly skilled at applying them to comedy.
Yeah, especially in a later period of his career. Once he gets to Son, I prefer the title Man I Killed. It's what they started with.
Yeah.
I think as I write in the article, that one of the things that's strange about it, it actually even has a cute meat in the cemetery.
Yes.
So, I think in terms of ambiguity, in a way, this goes with what I said earlier, there's a certain kind of ambiguity about the endings of the films in the later Lubitsch. The most disturbing one is going to be the ending of The Man I Killed.
Oh, yes.
Because he has, I think the reason I like that title is that basically, he's becoming at the end. The most disturbing thing, of course, is that the fiancé knows who he is. And yet, for the sake of the elderly couple, and, talk about ending with death, is we end with the people that are close to the ends of their life rather than the couple that are going to marry. This is it's the complete inverse of romantic comedy. You always end with the couple because the couple represents the future of civilization, right? The couple means that the race will continue, whatever struggles it has to face. Instead, the movie ends with the people who are close to death.
Yeah.
And the couple disappears from the show.
You have Lionel Barrymore's, famous speech mid-film is all about how the older generations essentially send the young off to die. And in a strange way, that's the ending too, right? You have the younger generation once again having to bear the burden and kind of further the illusions of the older generation. In this case, in a microcosm as opposed to a world war, but it's the same mechanism.
No, I think that's a great point. It's a great point. I agree. Getting back, we got off onto this place talking about Lubitsch as becoming a primarily comic director only in the 30s.
Yeah.
And that sort of seals his reputation. I think this is going back to Angel again. I think some of the difficulty that people had in understanding Angel was that they had forgotten this earlier part of his career. And, they looked at it expecting the usual comedy. Now, in fact, again, in terms of the screenplay, there was a lot more comedy in the screenplay involving secondary characters. One of the Grand Duchess's Confederates from fleeing the Soviet Union was a count who was a taxi driver. And the scenes with him are all comic. So what Lubitsch does is they eliminated, there was one other Russian emigre. Again, that a lot of the scenes around those characters were comedy. Lubitsch eliminated, they cut all that. All that stuff was film. I think, I saw an item, I think in Variety, that it was about 1,000 feet was cut from the film. So that the only comedy that you really have left in the film is mostly around the servants. But I think what's interesting is the way in which the servants operate as a kind of comic commentary on the lead characters. So that you have that scene, I think I write about this in the Lubitsch book. You have the scene of Walton, whatever, the butler who is involved with the Cockney woman, and they go to the races. The two, notice Herbert Marshall and Dietrich there. The butler has a certain degree of pretension about him, that he aligns himself with the upper classes. This woman's somewhat vulgar behavior is obviously distressing to him. Now, I think he has the lines about, that indicates he wants to be able to be proud of her in some way, and she doesn't behave in a way that's appropriate for that. She has to correct herself, catches herself and corrects what she's doing. So it's a kind of comic version of something that's going on between Marshall and Dietrich. There's a scene at the opera. He has this little monologue about how a man wants to be proud of his wife, show her off, and that kind of thing. So she becomes a trinket for him to display in a certain degree. So there's a kind of comedy there by inference, right?
Yeah.
But it's not the thing that you laugh at. It's an aspect of their relationship that has been turned into comedy through the secondary characters. But it's left with the secondary characters, and we can only imply its connection to them. The only other thing that, sort of interests me is the way in which the triangle is of the two men and the woman. So the first one since Designed for Living, of having the woman choose between two men.
Very different dynamic.
Yeah, it's a very different dynamic. But the other thing I've talked about is that one of the things that struck me on this most recent viewing that now I write about, as you know, is the extent to which the men seem to marry each other. And there is this constant staging of triangles in which the men operate. There's some images of Dietrich is in the center and the men are on opposite sides of the frame, but exactly in the same position, left and right, as if they themselves were mirror images of each other. Their first dialogue scene between each other is they face each other nose to nose, as if they're mirroring each other. One of the things that struck me about this is, and of course, in a way, it's sort of externalizing something that's inherent in Maria, is that Maria is two different people.
She's Maria and also she's Angel.
And of course, Tony will only call her Angel. Her and Frederick only knows her as Maria.
Yeah.
And, he has to confront the fact that she's Angel at the end, but tells her the only way he can accept her is if she renounces Angel. And, can she renounce Angel? And this is the ambiguity of the ending. I think I'm not the first person who's compared this movie to Belle de Jour, but I am, I think, the first to compare it to The Obscure Object of Desire, the Buñuel movie. It's the female lead is played by two different people, completely different, because one is French and looks like, she looks like your image of an elegant French woman, and the other woman is Spanish. But in any case, the other thing that fascinated me in showing the movie to kids is they didn't notice the difference. They didn't notice that the actress was different in different scenes. So what I've suggested is one of the things I think that in many ways, Angel is Lubitsch's most experimental work. And it's like Obscure Object of Desire, except in this case, the male lead is played by two men as a kind of parallel to the two characters that embody Maria and Angel. So anyway, not a comedy.
I think this might be a good opportunity to kind of talk about a film that is a comedy. It's the neuroscience of laughter and the purpose of laughter in To Be or Not to Be Especially. I think that's all kind of connected.
One thing I can say is that in a way, maybe this is something that Lubitsch is either unconsciously or consciously thinking about in this period, because I think you could also say that, and this might seem more obvious in this case, you could also say that Ninotchka is a film about laughter. It's certainly laughter plays a key, outside of the advertising of the film, but laughter plays the key transitional moment in the film.
Garbo laughs. One of the things that struck me about that is I was looking through these. I've read two books by two different neuroscientists on laughter. One's based on a lot of different observational studies, experimental psychologists have done. And he notes that women laugh more than men do. Also, which I found interesting, women laugh at men more than men laugh at women, in spite of a lot of misogynist jokes out there. But women laugh more than men do, and men try to get women to laugh more than vice versa. But I thought that was interesting because that's obviously the way that Leon ultimately seduces Ninotchka is by making her laugh. Yeah, not by making her laugh at his jokes, though. Making her laugh at his own pratfall is at him, not with him.
Yeah, and that's another thing about the nature of laughter we can come back to. But he certainly, if this guy is right, that men tell jokes in order to make women laugh because they know that women like to laugh, that's the way he's trying to woo her. Right? He's trying to woo her by making her laugh. But don't take the world so seriously. I've always thought, that moment, what she laughs at is actually an expression of class difference. She doesn't fall for his verbal wit. What she falls for is his slapstick comedy, a lower form of comedy, as convention usually has it. And also, she laughs at him, is that he is brought down a bit in that period, in that moment, and can laugh. So that is one of the things we can talk about with what is the function of laughter.
Neuroscience, yes.
Yeah, I don't know how much more extensive this is. I've read 2 books by people who claim to be neuroscientists, and these are books specifically about laughter. They might touch on jokes, joke formation, and so on. But, it's not really looking at too much works by artists producing laughter, by comic artists. One of the things that both books do, and I think this is useful, is to note that primates, in any case, do laugh, that we are not the only animal that laughs. So they've studied chimpanzees and laughing behaviors in chimpanzees and so on, and how laugh is connected to elements play, so on and so forth. They both draw on psychological studies. There's been a lot of observational psychology on laughter, which is where that last point about the differences of men and women in laughing have been observed. So one of the things, there's a couple of things that I thought were of interest. Let me see if I can find this thing on one of the observational studies. This is from one of the books. It's a book called Just Laughter, a Scientific Investigation. Psychological studies have shown that we laugh more when bad things happen to obnoxious people than to pleasant people, evidence of the aggressive roots of humor. And some of the claim for the aggressive roots is determined by looking at the chimpanzees and the way laughter can be used among chimpanzees as well. So I want to come back to that. I think this is relevant to be or not to be in particular. But the other thing I think is important, this is kind of looking at brain science. Different brain regions are involved in the expression of cognitively oriented speech and more primitive emotion-laden vocalization of laughter. One of the reasons that they do these animal studies is to point out that, in a way, laughter emerges before speech. And that's why he talks about it as being more primitive, and notices that actually, this is one of the more interesting observations that he makes, is that in order to arrive at human speech, people had to assume upright positions. And it's true that with children, speech begins to emerge around the same time that standing up and walking emerges. And the reason for that is you have to be upright in order to free the vocal cords from the task of breathing and be able to use them for speech as well. So in any case, the idea is that laughter is more primitive than speech. And this gives rise to something else. Laughter is not necessarily under our conscious control. This is actually something I want to come back to. One of these guys points out that one of the things that's most difficult for struggling actors to arrive at is laughing spontaneously in a part. It's very difficult to laugh consciously and make it sound convincing. Right? So from that, he concludes that laughter is not something that's under conscious control. It's something that we do automatically without thinking. That's important. And the other point that he notes is that I think is important for to be or not to be, is that a lot of comments that induce people to laugh are what he calls penetrating and uncensored because of the unconscious nature of most laugh production and the limited awareness people have of their own laugh. That's to say that we often don't know why we laugh, what the reasons for our laughing are. And I think this is something that is critical for to be or not to be. Now, I think there's one exception to this, which is irony. Although even there, it might not be entirely clear, which is to say that for an irony to work, irony involves a certain degree of decoding. A kind of formal definition of irony, it comes from the Greek word aeron, which is a character that would appear in Greek comedy. There's 2 ways of defining the aeron. There's a character who says less than he knows or knows more than he says, is a way of putting it. Irony is a way of speaking that always implies something other than what it says. Now, in the first book, in the Lubitsch book, I say that one of the most distinctive things about Lubitsch is the way in which he conjoins irony with metaphor. Drawing on a literary theorist named Wayne Booth, I point out that metaphor and irony are formally alike, because a metaphor always implies something other than what you're seeing or hearing, right? You're talking metaphorically means that you say one thing, but you actually mean something else. And that's, of course, also a formal definition of irony. And what's distinctive about Lubitsch, especially the later work, is the way that he conjoins metaphor and irony. So the irony gives his work its lightness, but the metaphor gives it its profundity. All of these things are just sort of by way of leading into thinking about the nature of comedy in Lubitsch. So I think even in the case of irony, do we ever fully register or think through the implied meaning? So going back to Trouble in Paradise, when Mariette says you're hired, she is hiring, but her tone in a way suggests ironic meaning because it's in response to saying he's going to give her a spanking. Do we really follow through on thinking about the implications of sadomasochism in the relationship?
That's a tough question to answer.
Yeah.
I think it depends on maybe the person and what they want to get out of that scene and out of that movie.
Yeah. So I think there's a way in which comedy can prevent people from thinking through what the implications are. Now, early in To Be or Not to Be, the first exchange between Carol Lombard and Jack Benny. So she's bordering on sarcastic when she says, "We all know you're the greatest actor in the world." Sarcasm is an extreme form of irony, right? Sarcasm is the one form of irony, and it doesn't necessarily always produce laughter because it's saying one thing for something else, but it doesn't hide its hidden meanings. And then she goes into the thing about,
whenever there's a chance to take the spotlight away from me, it's becoming ridiculous the way you grab attention. Whenever I start to tell a story, you finish it. If I go on a diet, you lose the weight. If I have a cold, you cough. And if we should ever have a baby, I'm not so sure I'd be the mother.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the joke. But Benny comes up with the topper to that.
I'm satisfied to be the father.
How much do we follow this through?
Yeah, it feels designed to be looked over, right? I mean, because the obvious implication, when you think about it for more than a second, is they're subtly, I don't even want to say implying, but they are gesturing towards mutual infidelities.
Yeah. Well, but in one way, it's Lombard's final statement there is comic because it's incongruous. How can she possibly not know she's the mother, right? The comedy's in the incongruity. Benny, Tura's comedy, which is typical of Benny, is funny as a topper, but it's also emasculating. I'd be satisfied to be the father. And this is actually something that's more typical of the Benny persona. There is something often self-emasculating about Benny's comic persona. Reviewers at the time saw that Benny was not purely Jack Benny in this movie, as he was in some other movies. We could say from the very beginning, it's a movie about passing, that it begins with somebody passing himself off as Hitler. The reason I'm intrigued by that is that there's certain ways Benny Kubelski, who's a child of immigrants from Poland, Jewish immigrants, it's never that he denied his Jewishness, but there's certain ways in which, compared to other prominent Jewish comics of the 20s and 30s, that Benny was passing. So that, for example, the show would celebrate Christmas. One of the famous Benny shows is called Christmas Shopping, where he's shopping for gifts. Mary Livingston, originally it was just a secretary on the show, and she became his wife eventually on the show, which she was in real life.
Her original name, she was born Sadia Markovitz.
Yeah. She originally appeared on the show under her actual name, and then oddly enough, took over the name of the character. She was playing, I think it was the Secretary of the City, and it was called Mary Livingston, but then eventually became Mary and took over the stage name as Jack Benny took over the stage name. One of the people who writes on Benny pointed out that what was distinctive about him in terms of the other Jewish comics of the period is that he was from the Midwest, not from New York. And so the thing that would seem to identify the other Jewish comics as specifically Jewish was that they had a New York accent. He had this Midwestern, upper Midwestern accent that seemed to distinguish him from the other comedians. And, in some cases, supposedly, when the Marx Brothers played at certain theaters in Brooklyn, they would incorporate some Yiddish into their acts. When Benny did nightclubs, depending on the audience, it's not that I think he ever used Yiddish. In any case, there was a degree, although he was a proponent of Israel, he gave money and so on and so forth to Jewish charities, he was to a degree passing on the show. And I think that's a factor in To Be or Not to Be, because he is distinguished from an overtly Jewish character like Greenberg.
Who is the only overtly Jewish character in that whole troupe, isn't he?
Yeah. In spite of the fact that one of the most famous theater companies in Warsaw, and this was internationally known, was the Yiddish Theater in Warsaw. Lubitsch would certainly have been aware of that. And I've often thought that in a way, this really is about the Yiddish Theater of Warsaw.
Which obviously wasn't politically possible to do a movie with that overt of a theme.
No, that would not be possible. But it is the first Lubitsch film that has an overtly Jewish character. Although, again, it's done indirectly and metaphorically. That how is he identified as Jewish? He's identified by saying, Mr. Ravitch.
What you are, I wouldn't eat.
Which is among Lubitsch's less obscure implications.
Yes, that one we get, although it's ironic and metaphorical.
Oh, yes.
Although Richard Corliss pointed out, he thought this ruined the joke, is that Ravitch turns around and says, how dare you
call me a ham?
In a way, you could say it explains the joke for people who don't get it, for people who don't understand the implication.
I always felt that there was just ever so slightly out of character for Lubitsch. I feel like Lubitsch, really, it's clear that Lubitsch or whoever was responsible for that particular line, but Lubitsch would have had to have accepted it, really wanted us to know that he was Jewish, like, unmistakably.
Yeah, the word Jewish is never mentioned in the movie. And this, in spite of the fact, and there's a lot of writing on this about how Tom Doherty writes about this a lot in his book on Jews in Hollywood in World War II. There's a lot of, and this is true, there's a lot of ethnic humor in early Hollywood sound films, a lot of ethnic characters. And partly some people have said, well, it's because of sound. You got to hear all these different accents in America. The melting pot America, so people would be defined by their accents. And, the Irish and the Italians speaking with heavy Italian accents, the Jewish characters that turn up a lot speaking with heavily inflected Jewish accents, and so on and so forth. And that's true. My favorite, actually, if you've never seen it, I think it's in Taxi. It's a movie called Taxi. There's a brief scene in which Jimmy Cagney has an exchange entirely in Yiddish. It's apparently about growing up in the Lower East Side. Cagney was apparently fluent in Yiddish. And there's a shift in later films where there's a movement away from having those kinds of stereotypical characters. Gangsters are no longer going to be Italian and things of that sort. At least they won't be necessarily portrayed that way, or Irish in the case of Cagney. In any case, with Chaplin, one of the things that was distinctive and unusual about The Great Dictator is the extent that it uses the word Jew. Chaplin is specifically identified as a Jewish character, although split, obviously playing two roles, the ultimate anti-Semite opposite him. What's interesting about that, too, is that Chaplin, I don't know if you've heard this, but there were a lot of rumors, and it is written about in biographies, and Doherty mentions it as well. There were always rumors that Chaplin was Jewish, or at least partly Jewish, which turns out not to be true at all. What's interesting with Chaplin is Chaplin never denied it. And it was a fairly public rumor, and he never denied it. Paulette Goddard, his co-star in Great Dictator, was Jewish. The unusual thing with Great Dictator, it's the first movie that doesn't end with a shot of Charlie. It ends with a close-up of Paulette Goddard as well. Okay, so that's just going off onto that, which is another movie that plays with comedy and drama as well. So I think Lubitsch is obviously very aware of that show, and yet is a little more reticent about the Jewishness of the characters. Just, basically making it Greenberg. I guess the point of departure was the ways in which it is a film about the nature of passing and acting as somebody other than who you are, but drawing on your own identity. And a lot of the comedy in the film plays around this juncture between who people are and who they actually are. Acting, right? It's a film that is centrally concerned with the nature of acting, and with that, the nature of passing yourself off. Okay, how to work our way back to comedy on that?
Well, comedy plays an important part in passing, doesn't it?
This brings us back to irony.
Yeah.
Because you can be ironic in a way that the audience recognizes because they're in on the joke. And it's not just Betty, but obviously Maria in her exchanges with Seletsky can say things to him that she is clearly being ironic about, and he doesn't get.
Yeah.
Irony is beyond him.
One element I find interesting and novel in this film is that her other partner is even less able to understand the irony. There's no kind of dichotomy between the partner. Even in Angel, you have one partner who kind of gets the irony. You know, Melvin Douglas kind of understands the masks. And in this case, Robert Stack is even more oblivious.
He is. One thing I accept Maria at face value, and this is not because of the PCA. I don't think that relationship is ever sexual.
Mm-hmm.
I think she is parallel to Tura in this regard. It's that she wants to be center stage. She's the star of that romance.
She likes being looked up to? Or
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
She likes being the star in that situation, and she encourages it. She obviously encourages it. As she says, actually, I think this line was cut. This is the one line that was actually cut. What could happen to the play?
Yeah, I slightly rue the loss of that line. It's a censorship decision that I think is relatively uncontroversial.
Yeah, I think it would have happened without Lombard's actually death in a plane. So I think that's one thing, is that it's a lot of the comedy in the film obviously works around the people who are able to play and to people who don't realize that they're playing. That's one thing. But the other thing, that's obviously striking, this is one of the things that is striking about the movie, is a lot of the comedy relates to something that I read from earlier on The Neuroscientist. Let me see if I can refer to this again.
Mm-hmm.
It comes from Bergson, is that Bergson suggests that laughter is a means of forging compliance to group norms through humiliation. Most of us, in fact, laughed at social outliers, although, as we shall see, we do not consciously choose to act this way. Further on, he notes that laughter has a non-linguistic role in social bonding, solidifying friendships, and pulling people into the fold. But laughter, its darker side, is when group members coordinate their laughter to deal and exclude outsiders.
Mm-hmm.
This is the neuroscientist talking in terms of looking at sort of behavioral norms and psychological studies of laughter. We laugh at people. When you say that, it's perfectly clear that laughter is something that diminishes the other person, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's part of its function. One of the things in To Be or Not to Be that makes the laughter that's somewhat disturbing is a lot of the laughter is directed against members of the troupe because of vanity. This goes back to what I wanted to talk about with Benny, is I think one of the crucial things with Jack Benny's comic persona is that it was very important for him to pass, because if he didn't, he has what is referred to in literary terms as comic vices. Comic vices are those things that make us laugh at other people.
Mm-hmm.
And what are Jack Benny's comic vices? He's vain, he is greedy, and he is somewhat effeminate. In other words, he's an anti-Semitic stereotype and has to have this veneer of being a Gentile who can be greedy on Christmas shopping because he's not overtly Jewish.
In comparison to Greenberg, who is technically not overtly Jewish, but he's the next closest thing. And he does not have those vices. When comedy is not directed at him, but kind of revolves around him, it's mostly about his station, right? He is a spirit carrier. The film does not imply that he is a spirit carrier because he is greedy, etc., etc. He's a spirit carrier because that's the stage of his career he's at. And as a result, he gets to do the most heroic thing in the film. There's an interesting comparison there.
And Benny will take credit away from it at the end of the film. It's important that we laugh at a lot of these characters.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I've noticed with Greenberg, and I want to write some more about this, I actually do say this in the book, is a lot of the people, when they write about Greenberg's use of the Rialto speech from Shakespeare, which incidentally, in To Be or Not to Be, censors the word Jew.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not the only person who's noticed this, but what people don't notice is they actually focus on the two times that he uses the speech. But what gets overlooked, except in me, is that the first time he delivers the speech is comic.
Mm-hmm.
We are supposed to laugh at him for his presumption in giving the speech. If we don't get that from the performance that we're supposed to see as comic, there's that thing where it's an over-the-shoulder shot where he's looking at Brodsky, Tom Dugan, and he is declaiming, and Dugan's wig flies backwards from the breath of his enthusiastic declaiming of the speech.
Mm-hmm.
It's clearly comic, and we are clearly meant to laugh at that character. the first time he gives the speech.
And that makes it all the more painful when we see him give it again.
Yeah, but each time it's different. The next two times it's clearly pathetic when they're shoveling snow, at the end of which he says, I wish I could carry a spear again. At the end of that speech, Dugan says how great he would have been after this ridiculous performance. And so it goes from comedy to becoming serious drama and somewhat tense. A lot of the contemporary reviews actually invoked Hitchcock on this film, thought it had a thriller element to it that was like Hitchcock.
I agree with the first clause of that there's a thriller element, but not that it's like Hitchcock.
Yeah, I don't see it. Maybe you have to think about 40s Hitchcock more than what came later. Well, when Maria goes into the bookstore to pass the code, there's tension when, he didn't have to have the Nazis in there buying a book.
No.
I think the final scene with Greenberg is suspenseful.
The whole climax is kind of unbearably tense.
And so I think there is a lot of suspension because we have, at this point, we can question if Greenberg is actually going to be able to pull off this performance. Given that the first time we saw it was comic, the second time was pathetic, will he be able to bring it off in a way that actually gets the drama of the speech? That is the suspense of that moment. So there's a play between comedy and drama in this. And Angel Lubitsch sort of eliminated a lot of the comedy to make it primarily a complex and experimental drama, I think. And here, he himself has a sense that he's doing something experimental. We know from his response to Bosley Crowther that he wasn't going to use comedy as comic relief. And conversely, he wasn't going to have drama as relief from the colony.
No attempt to relieve anyone from anything, right?
Yeah, that it was going to be a just kind of constant back and forth. I think he was right to say that. And I think it's one of the things that gives the film its distinctive flavor. That said, it might be a good time to talk about the contemporary reception.
Yes, this I'm very curious about.
This was something that was either misunderstood or falsely interpreted for reasons that people want to see it as out of its time period in a certain way.
Yeah, it helps mythologize it a bit.
Yeah, Weinberg says this, that, it was black comedy ahead of its time. Ahead of its time, the biggest running play on Broadway in that period was Arsenic and Old Lace, which is about two sweet little old ladies who murdered people. And, the corpses in that movie are quite funny as well. There's a corpse that they stowed away in a trunk. And that was a huge hit on Broadway. It ran so long, Frank Capra made a film of it, but they had to delay the release of the film because they couldn't release it while it was still running on Broadway. So enormously popular. We can't say that black comedy is actually unusual. Okay, so first off, in the Lubitsch book, I did point out that the film mostly had a favorable reception. We'll come back to the notorious line, but even the most notorious line, and it was praised by Time magazine as the funniest line in the movie. And that was based on reading about 20 or so reviews that were in a file at the Performing Arts Library of the New York Public Library. I went back, and I spent way too much time on this because I'm a notoriously slow reader, but I went back to the library to look at that folder. Since I wanted to write, I knew I wanted to write about this. I wanted to write about the nature of comedy in this. And I was sort of irritated by the fact that nobody paid attention to me. And I've continued to say that the movie was controversial. It wasn't. So I went back to look at the folder and discovered that the library, and it must have been acquired afterwards, had another folder in the Edwin Justice Mayer papers. This had a clipping file, quite thick. It was because Mayer was primarily a playwright. He did do some movie writing for the money, but he had a clipping service, which most Hollywood screenwriters would not bother with. But as a playwright, it was important for him to have the clipping service because a lot of plays made their money after the Broadway run from taking it on the road and playing it all over the country. And that's where a lot of the money would come in. So how well it did elsewhere was of interest to him. And I have ended up now reading literally 161 reviews of the movie from all over the country. So I can say this definitively. The movie was mostly very well received. There were only maybe 5 reviews that were negative, most famously the Bosley Crowther and then one in the Philadelphia Inquirer. These are the two that get quoted the most often, and they get quoted more than any of the positive reviews. Some of them were mixed, but it was a small number. Again, the vast majority were positive. The mixed reviews were of the nature of saying something like, it's a really funny movie, but at times you can feel a little uncomfortable about the comedy because it is about the invasion of Warsaw, and that's still so fresh in our memories.
Mm-hmm.
But they didn't dismiss the movie for that reason. And most of the reviews were favorable. The other thing that has often been said about it, as Herman Weinberg says it, is that part of the reception was affected by Lombard's death. But an incredibly high number of the reviews, it was almost as if it was a formula that they all wrote, is that they would often begin with Lombard's death and say that, I really hesitated. I had apprehensions about seeing the movie ahead of time because, her death was so recent. But within 1 or 2 moments of her appearing on the screen, she is so alive and so vital, and she is giving such a wonderful performance, you completely forget the airplane crash.
Mm.
And then the other formula was to move on to Benny and say that he's emerged as a real actor in this film. And that's what the majority of reviews were. Now, the other thing that was kind of amazing was at least 8 reviews singled out as the funniest line in the movie. What he did to Shakespeare, we are now doing to Poland.
Oh, interesting.
That is supposedly the most contentious line in the movie that, according to Weinberg, friends of Lubitsch encouraged him to take out.
You have that famous anecdote, right, where the first preview screening, everyone kind of accosted him, or his closest circle of friends, and including Vivian Lubitsch, all accosted him to tell him to take it out, right?
Yeah, and he was very insistent about keeping it. But Lubitsch's defense of this was that it was a demonstration of that foul Nazi humor, and that's why he had to keep it.
Mm-hmm.
I want to also go back to theater history a little bit in some way and to situate this within the contemporary practice of reviewing. In this period, and I think this goes into the 60s, I did some reviewing for the Village Voice and Rolling Stone in the 70s. And what I was doing was what was pretty standard and continues to be the case. Critics would see a new movie at special screenings that the studio set up for the critic. And usually it would sometimes be even several weeks in advance of the opening of the film, so you had plenty of time to write your review. And this is one reason why I think it was around in the 70s, late 70s or 80s or so, that the newspapers began running reviews on the day of release rather than the day after. But in the period that we're talking about now with the Lubitsch, is the reviews would always appear the day after. What's more, critics would see the movie in the theater with an audience. They would see it on the first day of release. They did not get an advance view of it. There was one exception with To Be or Not to Be. It's just the critic mentions it, is for some reason the critic was going to have trouble getting to the movie in what was called the local exchange, which is where the films were sent to be distributed in each area. Set up a screening for this critic ahead of time so he'd be able to get the reviewer at the appropriate time. But that was unusual. And mostly they saw it with an audience. And in the case of New York City, which is where, the largest number of reviews were written, screenings started at 10 o'clock in the morning. So critics would often be there for the first screening. And you could actually get fairly large audiences at that time. The reason in New York we started at 10 o'clock in the morning is that the theater could fill up, and certainly at the noon hour it would be quite full. So even if they didn't get to it until 12, they would see it. So it was handled like live theater. Live theater, if you've ever seen All About Eve, where they're waiting for the reviews to come out, in live theater, the critic would see the play and then rush back to the office and type out his review, and it would end up in the morning paper. And so film was handled in pretty much the same way. You'd see it with an audience. So what I want to posit is something happened at the screenings that gave rise to these very diverse responses, which is that audiences laughed uproariously at what he did to Shakespeare. We are now doing to Poland. And I can say that actually one of the people who thought the line was extremely funny did mention the audience. Bosley Crowther was offended by the laughter, not by Lubitsch specifically, but by the laughter, which then made the film offensive to her. I think that's important in terms of the film's reception. People who claim the movie was at all controversial are wrong. The only controversy was with a couple of critics, and that hardly counts as a controversy if most people think it's a terrific film.
Do you think it impacted significantly the cultural memory of the controversy, the fact that Lubitsch was so moved by Bosley Crowther's words that he felt the need to respond in his own op-ed? Do you think that might have, today we would call it the Streisand effect, do you think that might have blown it up a bit?
Yeah, I think, there's a couple of things to say about this, which is that, the Times was considered very influential.
Mm-hmm.
It was in one way, and to a certain degree, Hollywood movies didn't care that much about what critics say. And you don't really begin to see critics being quoted in advertising in any manner until the 50s, except for foreign cinema. And with foreign film, the Times Review was often considered to be something that could kill a movie. If a foreign film opened in New York, and especially Crowther, but even people preceding Crowther, if he wrote a negative review, that was it for the box office on that film. So I think there was a sense that the Times was an important review. And there was also a pretty angry review from the Philadelphia Inquirer, but the one that Lubitsch answered was the Times.
Interesting.
I don't think he wrote a response to her. And Lubitsch mostly got very favorable reviews from the Times. So I think, it's like he was hurt personally and felt that he was doing something original. I think, and the film is very personal to him. It's the only one that really originates with him in terms of the story. It's not based on one of his Hungarian playwrights.
No, it'd be tough to, considering the topicality of it.
Yeah. In terms of whether or not audiences were expected to laugh at that joke, if there hadn't been this controversy, I don't think Lubitsch would have defended it in the way that he did. So I want to get into something else. This is not from neuroscience. This is actually basically from vaudeville and comic traditions. There's something called the rule of three. And the rule of three is that you bring in something, you repeat it, and the third time it comes in is the time it gets the laugh. And Lubitsch can use this a lot. Sometimes he goes to four as well, like in Maria's thing about, if I get a cold, you sneeze. She has 4 examples.
Yeah.
But for example, in Trouble in Paradise, the mutual thefts are 3. And the topper is taking her girder, right? When you get the repetition, it's the third one that always is the one that brings the laugh. So in this case, also then keeping in mind the thing with neuroscience is that we laugh at comic vices. We laugh at things that we want to react against. And if you think of the physiology of laughter, it's a sudden expulsion of breath. So we want to push the person, we want to push it away to some degree. It's a rejection. In terms of the comic vice of vanity, the first example of this is that thing with Maria. Everyone knows you're the greatest actor in the world. And the next example is talking to Zalewski. Have you seen that great Polish actor, Joseph Tura? Zalewski said, no, I've never seen him. That's the second example.
Yeah.
The third we need is the one that's going to get the laugh. We're already tittering about his vanity a little bit. I've been encouraged to laugh at it by Maria. But the third example is going to be the Boffo one, the one that tops all of them.
And that's the one associated with the famous line.
Yes.
Her husband is that great Polish actor, Joseph Tura. You've probably heard of him.
Oh, yes. As a matter of fact, I saw him on the stage when I was in Warsaw once before the war.
Really?
What he did to Shakespeare, we are doing now to Poland.
So structurally, the important thing to say, and actually, I think I can find another comic from the neuroscientist on this, but structurally, laughter is morally indifferent. We are prompted to laugh by various cues and without thinking. The lines I have with neuroscientists is that we're unconscious of why we laugh. We don't think about it. And there are certain formal things that can produce a laugh. Structurally, the film sets us up to laugh at that line. And we do so without thinking. Do we really think about what they're doing to Poland? No. What we think about is that it's finally time to give Tura his just desserts on this. It's finally time to see him really completely devastated by somebody who had seen his performance.
It's interesting because there's 2 comic phrases in the line, right? There's what he did to Shakespeare.
Right.
And then there's what we are now doing to Poland. And to me, I've always kind of parsed the comic mechanism of that line as the first half is what makes you laugh and the second half is what makes you feel kind of guilty for laughing. At least, what we are now doing to Poland suddenly throws, especially to a modern viewer who very well knows what's happening to Poland, throws your whole reaction into question. At least that's how I've always experienced it personally. But yes, the center of that thing's comedy is Tura, the character.
Right. Well, the other way of looking at this is, again, something that neuroscientists write about is that there has to be, this is actually a different neuroscientist, he talks about how there has to be both a consistency from the element of surprise that makes sense. That is, you can say something that's surprising, but wouldn't make sense. So it's got to be both coherent and surprising. So what he did to Shakespeare, we are now doing to Poland. The setup of the joke is what he did to Shakespeare.
Yeah.
The surprise is we're not doing to Poland. And, it's startling. And that's partly why we laugh, because we're startled by that. However, I want to also point out that formally, there's a stylistic continuity in the dialogue. What you are, I wouldn't need. It's the same pattern.
That did occur to me. And do you think that's incidental and that's just how Lubitsch likes to structure his jokes? Or do you think there's an intentional rhythm there?
I would say both. Partly because I wouldn't want to claim it's conscious or unconscious. I would simply say it sets us up to laugh at that joke when it appears. One last thing I wanted to say on this. There's one guy, I think a professor at Brandeis, who writes on To Be or Not to Be, and is completely dismissive of my entire book. He has, I think, one really good point in the book. Greenberg is the one person from the troupe who's not in the penultimate scene, the scene when they land in Scotland. Now, I think to some degree, I don't know how often we notice it or people notice it. I would say we're not worried that Greenberg has actually been taken away by the Gestapo because we know that other members of the troupe took him and that he is presumably safely in hiding. So it's not as if we end the film with a sense that he's in danger because the Nazis have taken over. So you can say that maybe the fact that we don't see him, in spite of the apparent resolution of the movie, indicates, as it should in 1942, that there's still a danger of the Nazi takeover. So that's one way possibly of making sense out of it.
I do think that necessarily anyone writing about the film, especially post-1945, their interpretation of that is going to be colored by what happened after, right? Yeah. Which Lubitsch and company could not physically have known what was being planned. I believe the Wannsee conference occurred midway through production. That can't help but color our now, 80 years later, perception of what Lubitsch was implying by that. It was bad, but not as bad as it would later get, if that makes sense.
Well, to take another laugh line that people at the time did not object to, that I think people now are much more uncomfortable by, but was comic in the period was So They Call Me Concentration Camp Hero. It's a lot harder to laugh at concentration camps now.
Yeah.
I won't say they ever seemed benign, but they didn't seem quite as horrifying as they were revealed to be later on. One thing I wanted to mention, I was living in Germany, in Berlin specifically, in 1964-65. When I was there, and I think it probably was in 65, because I think it was the second semester, I took a year off from school and spent it at the Freie Universität, the Free University of Berlin. And I think it was in the winter, they did what I thought was the German premiere of To Be or Not to Be. It might have just been the Berlin premiere of it. I know it was some premiere. The only reason I say that is the IMDb says the West German premiere was in 1960. The movie was withheld, although Lubitsch was the famous son of Berlin. And it played in Berlin. It was treated as a premiere. And maybe it was just the Berlin premiere in 1965. And one of the things they did, it was shown at kind of an art theater and showed it in English language with subtitles. And that was unusual. In Germany, most films are dubbed. They very rarely show movies in their original language. They have an extensive dubbing industry. In any case, I was there maybe the first night, I can't remember, but the theater was completely packed. And it was one of the stranger film experiences I've ever had. So it was the first time I saw the movie. And what would happen is the laughs were working. People would laugh, and then all of a sudden, you'd do shh, shh, shh. And other people would basically truncate the laughter. And this happened over and over again throughout the movie. So it was fascinating seeing that with a German audience.
Yeah.
Anyway, getting back to that second to last scene, I thought one of the reasons for not having Greenberging is that scene is a way of saying, okay, it's following kind of convention of after disruption, reverting to normality, right? And often one of the conventions of romantic comedy, and this is a convention that's so old, it goes back to Roman theater, is at a certain point about either 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through the comedy, that it stops being a comedy. It becomes very serious. In romantic romantic comedy, it's usually that there are real impediments that are suddenly facing the resolution of the union of the comic couple. And sometimes in some romantic comedies, it looks like there's going to be no way of bridging that gulf. And the return to comedy is what solves the problems between the couple. But there's always this moment where the comedy just goes off completely into drama and then returns to comedy. And we have that kind of reassertion of the world of comedy at the end. And the reassertion of the world of comedy has to be done with Tura's vanity, because it's the vainness of all the characters. And that includes Dobosh and Brodsky initially, too. It's the vanity of all the characters in the theater company that's a major source of comedy throughout the first part. And so the reassertion of comedy at the end, or at the penultimate scene, comes through Tura's vanity when he says, and I want to thank all the other people in the cast.
As little as it may have been.
Yeah.
If Greenberg were in that scene, he wouldn't be able to say it because Greenberg is the real hero.
Yeah.
And even so, I don't think what he did to Shakespeare is the most uncomfortable line in the film. I think as little as they did is the most uncomfortable line in the film. And I think the important thing, again, is to understand that it's often seen because comedy can be used against villains, right? We criticize the things we don't like in other people by laughing at them. But it's morally neutral. It's difficult to laugh when you don't find something funny. Laughter is a spontaneous response that we have to certain stimuli. And for that reason, if you put all the right stimuli in place, you're going to laugh. And you laugh without thinking. You laugh without thinking necessarily of why you're laughing. And I think in a lot of cases, especially when it deals with things like sexuality or things that might make us uncomfortable, in a lot of cases, we might not like to laugh. In Laughing, Screaming, I write about this a bit. This is going to be one of the tricky parts of the book, is that people often say the worst thing you can do to a joke is explain it, right? And that's a way of saying, we don't want to know. And because I know this is going to be a problem with the book, because I'm going to write about a lot of very gross comedy and then try to explain the jokes, is that on the contrary, I think that explaining a joke can only serve to make the joke funnier. It's to really dig down and look at all the underlying meanings that a joke can so concisely encapsulate, has got to blow you away by how rich jokes are.
If the joke is good.
If a joke is good. It has that kind of richness that actually is kind of fun to explore if you're willing to go beyond the spontaneous reaction and say, now, why exactly did I respond that way? And that's kind of awful.
I mean, I guess my last question for you is there anything about Ernst Lubitsch in particular that circa when this comes out, 2024, which is quite something, you want to leave 2024 audiences with?
You could say that, given my own background, is that my grandparents were Jews who emigrated to the U.S. from Poland, somewhat earlier than Lubitsch did, emigrated to Hollywood and things of that sort, that you might say there was something very personal about Lubitsch for me, but it actually wasn't that at all. The film that did it for me, and I think I'd already seen Trouble in Paradise, the film that made me want to write on Lubitsch was actually Clooney Brown. And the reason for it, I was already in grad school. I hadn't fully decided what I wanted to write on. I had to write a dissertation. I was in a PhD program, a now defunct PhD program. It lasted for about 5 years at Columbia. And 20th Century Fox had begun a major restoration of its library, of its old films, working together with University of California and Museum of Modern Art. A good number of the restorations were done at MoMA. They actually showed me a nitrate Technicolor print of Heaven Can Wait. They projected it for me, which was one of the nicest things that MoMA ever did for me. Just seeing an original one was gorgeous. In any case, MoMA was involved in the restorations in UCLA. It's like they each took half of the collection. The first 4 films they did on it were shown at the famous New Yorker Repertory Theater in New York. One of them was Unfaithfully Yours, the last good Sturges movie. And I can't remember the other 2 now, but the 4th was Clooney Brown. And let's say the restoration, even though it was acetate rather than nitrate, the restoration was gorgeous. They did a spectacular job with it. It is one of the most beautiful black and white films I'd ever seen. It sparkled, would be the only way of describing it, in the way that only black and white can sparkle, more than color does. So that was part of it. It was just seeing this pristine, brand new, gorgeous, gorgeous print of Clooney Brown. But the other thing that I had is at the end of the film, which I enjoyed, I just had the sense, this was a sense that the sensibility behind this film was completely foreign to me. I didn't understand it. And I wanted to understand, because this movie was so obviously informed by a distinctive personality, sensibility. I wanted to understand it. And that was when I said, I want to work on this guy. I don't know if that makes sense.
My moment of that was more diffuse and spread out amongst a few films, but I can definitely understand that moment because seeing Shop Around the Corner and To Be or Not to Be, Merry Widow and Clooney Brown and a few others, and just seeing the connective fibers in personality and instinct between those films and going, I love this.
Yeah.
This person's view on life and their attitude towards humanity is so intoxicating and so full of love that I couldn't help myself.
Yeah, well, I think I feel much the same way. And yeah, I guess what I could say, maybe this is a thing to end on, I wasn't sure. I have said I've taught Lubitsch over the years, most often Trouble in Paradise, and it's been all the American films. I've never taught any of the German films. But I never thought I really wanted to revisit Lubitsch as well. And so I guess I can say that I am very glad I did. I'm thankful for the excuse you've given me to talk about revisiting him and thinking about him some more. And what can I say? It turns out I love Lubitsch as much as I originally did.
Oh, it warms my heart to hear all of that. I don't think I've mentioned this on air, but your work has influenced the direction of this whole enterprise fundamentally. And to hear you say that me accosting you to talk to you for what's been 4.5 hours of discussion on Lubitsch has helped reinvigorate your enthusiasm and rediscover that even in a little small way, that makes my year. This will be the last episode I do in 2023. And I think I only have 2 more. And this is actually, you know what? This is the last episode of this whole show I'm doing that is about Lubitsch. And so I can't imagine a better, more appropriate way to close out that recording cycle than this. You have my endless thanks.
Well, I thank you too.
I also would be remiss not to mention that you have a potential reissue of your book. At some point, hopefully, I will re-record this if it comes to pass by the time we release this.
Well, you could also say if any publishers are listening.
You've read my mind, because I'm going to say in the meantime, if anyone listening to this has any connection to a book publisher, Bill's book, which I've probably referenced it more than just about any other on this show, which is an incredible book about Ernst Lubitsch, a critical study that I think is essential. It is currently out of print and it could be yours. Find a publisher who might be willing to give it a look. But I hope that this is rendered moot by the time we release this and that your book will be available at some point soon, because I will be first in line to stockpile copies for my own nefarious ends.
Oh, thank you.
Next week, Dara and Ryan Jaffe join us to discuss To Be or Not to Be. Head over to ernstcast.com for information as to where you might find the films we'll be discussing this season and other resources such as show notes and our Discord server. How Would Lubitsch Do It is a production of Moving Image Agency. Brennan King and Eden Coate Foster were our dialogue editors for this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us on whatever podcast platform you happen to use. It helps other people find our podcast and therefore find Ernst Lubitsch. We'd like to acknowledge that this podcast was produced on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples.